Before David wore a crown, he carried a shepherd's staff. Before Israel's army shouted his name, he was tending his father's sheep while his brothers stood before a prophet. And when the oil was poured over him, another man still occupied the throne, a troubled king who would soon bring the newly anointed shepherd into his own house. Samuel was still mourning for Saul when the Lord confronted his grief. Saul had been rejected from continuing as king over Israel, and Samuel was not to mourn indefinitely. He was to fill his horn with oil and go to Jesse of Bethlehem, because one of Jesse's sons had been chosen as king. Samuel asked how he could go. If Saul heard about the mission, he would kill him. He was told to take a heifer and announce that he had come to offer a sacrifice. Jesse would be invited to the sacrifice, and Samuel would be shown what to do. He was to anoint the son identified for him. Samuel did as he was commanded. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the town's elders came trembling to meet him. They asked whether he came in peace. Samuel assured them that he did. He had come to sacrifice to the Lord. They were to consecrate themselves and attend the sacrifice. Samuel also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them. When they entered, Samuel saw Jesse's eldest son, Eliab. His appearance immediately drew Samuel's attention, and Samuel concluded that the Lord's anointed stood before him. But Eliab had not been chosen. Samuel was told not to judge by Eliab's appearance or height. The Lord had rejected him. Human beings looked at outward appearance, but the Lord looked at the heart. Jesse then called Abinadab and had him pass before Samuel. Samuel said that the Lord had not chosen him. Jesse presented Shammah with the same result. One after another, Jesse had 7 sons pass before Samuel. Each son was seen and each was set aside. None was the man Samuel had been sent to anoint. Samuel asked Jesse whether these were all his sons. Jesse answered that the youngest remained, and he was keeping the sheep. Samuel told him to send for the young man. The gathering would not sit down until he arrived. Jesse sent for David and brought him in. David was healthy in appearance, with beautiful eyes and a handsome face. The command came immediately. Rise and anoint him. This is the one. Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers. From that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. David had been chosen and anointed, but Saul remained king over Israel. He still occupied the royal house, commanded the army, and governed the nation. David returned to the work that had kept him outside with the flock. At the same time, Saul's condition changed. The Spirit of the Lord departed from him, and a harmful spirit from the Lord terrified him. His servants recognized his distress and spoke to him about it. If Saul gave the order, they would search for someone skilled at playing the lyre. Whenever the harmful spirit came upon the king, the musician could play with his hand, and Saul would feel better. Saul agreed. "Find me someone who plays well," he commanded, "and bring him to me." One of the servants already knew a suitable man. He identified a son of Jesse in Bethlehem who played skillfully. He also described David as courageous, capable in battle, careful in speech, and impressive in appearance. The Lord was with him. The recommendation joined David's skill with qualities the royal household valued. Saul needed a musician, and his servant presented David as someone able to stand in the king's presence and serve there. Saul sent messengers to Jesse. "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." Jesse prepared a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat. He sent the provisions to Saul with David. David entered the king's service and stood before him. Saul loved him greatly and made him one of his armor-bearers. David would now carry equipment for the same king whose position had been denied to Jesse's other sons and assigned to him. Then Saul sent another message to Jesse. David had found favor in the king's sight, and Saul wanted him to remain in his service. Whenever the harmful spirit came upon Saul, David took up the lyre and played. The music brought relief. Saul felt better, and the harmful spirit left him. The son anointed in Bethlehem now served inside Saul's household, carrying armor and playing music for the reigning king. He also continued returning to Bethlehem to tend his father's sheep. Then the Philistines gathered their forces for war. They assembled near Socoh in Judah and camped between Socoh and Azekah at Ephes-dammim. Saul and the men of Israel gathered in the valley of Elah and formed their battle line against them. The Philistines occupied one slope and Israel occupied the other. The valley lay between the armies. Each force could see the ranks across from it, but the challenge that followed was directed toward one man. A champion named Goliath came out from the Philistine camp. He was from Gath and stood 6 cubits and a span in height. He wore a bronze helmet and a coat of scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels. Bronze armor covered his legs, and a bronze javelin was slung across his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. A shield-bearer walked ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted toward the Israelite ranks. Why had they come out and formed for battle? He was a Philistine, and they were servants of Saul. Let them choose one man to come down and fight him. If the Israelite was able to fight and kill Goliath, the Philistines would become Israel's servants. If Goliath killed him, Israel would become servants of the Philistines. Then Goliath openly defied Israel's ranks and demanded an opponent. Saul and the Israelites heard him and were terrified. David was a son of Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons and was already an old man. His 3 eldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had followed Saul to war. David was the youngest. He continued moving between Saul's service and his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, Goliath came forward each morning and evening and presented himself before Israel. His repeated appearance held the same demand before Saul's army: send one man into the valley and let the result determine who would serve whom. Then Jesse sent David to the camp. He gave him an ephah of roasted grain and 10 loaves of bread for his brothers. He also sent 10 cheeses for the commander of their unit. David was to see how his brothers were doing and bring back some assurance concerning them. The errand concerned food, their welfare, and evidence that the 3 men serving with Saul were safe. Early the next morning, David left the sheep with another keeper. He took the provisions and went as Jesse had directed him. He reached the camp as the army was moving into formation and raising the battle cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up opposite each other. David left the supplies with the keeper of the baggage and ran toward the battle line. He found his brothers and greeted them. While he was speaking with them, Goliath stepped out from the Philistine ranks and delivered the same challenge. This time David heard every word. The Israelite soldiers saw Goliath and retreated from him in great fear. As they moved back, they spoke about the reward Saul had promised. The king would give great wealth to the man who killed the Philistine. He would also give that man his daughter in marriage and grant special freedom to his father's household in Israel. David asked what would be done for the man who killed this Philistine and removed the disgrace from Israel. Then he asked who this uncircumcised Philistine was, that he should defy the armies of the living God. The soldiers repeated the king's promised reward. David continued asking, and his eldest brother heard him. Eliab became angry. He demanded to know why David had come down and with whom he had left those few sheep in the wilderness. He accused David of arrogance and wickedness and said that David had come only to watch the battle. "What have I done now?" David answered. "Was it not only a question?" He turned away from Eliab and asked someone else. The men gave him the same answer as before. David's words were overheard and reported to Saul. The king sent for him. David stood before Saul and told him that no one should lose heart because of Goliath. David himself would go and fight the Philistine. Saul rejected the proposal. David was a young man. Goliath had been a warrior from his youth. The difference Saul named was one of age and fighting experience, and nothing David carried into the audience resembled the Philistines' equipment. David answered by describing the dangers he had faced while keeping Jesse's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off an animal from the flock, David went after it. He struck the predator and rescued the sheep from its mouth. If the animal rose against him, David seized it, struck it, and killed it. David had killed both lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine would become like one of them because he had defied the armies of the living God. David did not credit his survival to strength alone. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul gave his permission. "Go," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." Saul dressed David in his own military equipment. He placed a bronze helmet on David's head and fitted him with armor. David fastened Saul's sword over the clothing and tried to walk. He was not accustomed to the equipment. "I cannot go in these," David said, "because I have not tested them." He removed the armor. David took his staff in his hand, selected 5 smooth stones from the stream, and placed them in his shepherd's bag. With his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. As David went out, Saul turned to Abner, the commander of the army. "Whose son is that young man?" Abner swore that he did not know. Saul told him to find out whose son David was. Goliath continued advancing, with his shield-bearer ahead of him. When he looked David over and saw that he was young, healthy, and handsome, he despised him. "Am I a dog," Goliath demanded, "that you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods. Then he called for David to come closer and threatened to give his flesh to the birds and wild animals. David answered that Goliath came against him with sword, spear, and javelin. David came against Goliath in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies, whom the Philistine had defied. That day, David declared, the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hand. David would strike him down and cut off his head. The bodies of the Philistine army would be given to the birds and wild animals. Then all the earth would know that there was a God in Israel. Everyone gathered in the valley would know that the Lord did not save by sword or spear, because the battle belonged to him. The Philistines would be delivered into Israel's hands. Goliath moved forward to meet him. David ran quickly toward the battle line. He did not stop to take up a sword or replace the armor he had removed. He reached into his bag, took out one stone, fitted it to his sling, and released it. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead and sank into it. The Philistine fell face down on the ground. David had overcome him with a sling and a stone. He had no sword in his hand. He ran to Goliath, stood over him, and drew the Philistine's own sword from its sheath. David killed him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and fled. The proposed contest had ended with the man representing them lying dead in the valley. The men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued them toward Gath and the gates of Ekron. Philistine bodies fell along the road through Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from the pursuit, they plundered the Philistine camp. David took Goliath's head to Jerusalem and placed the Philistines' weapons in his tent. When David returned from killing Goliath, Abner brought him before Saul. David was still carrying the Philistine's head. Saul asked him, "Whose son are you, young man?" David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." Jonathan was listening as David spoke to Saul, and a lasting bond formed between the king's son and the shepherd from Bethlehem. Jonathan loved David as he loved himself and made a covenant with him. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his military clothing, sword, bow, and belt. The king's son placed the visible marks of his own position and service into David's hands. Saul kept David with him from that day and did not allow him to return permanently to Jesse's household. David went wherever Saul sent him and succeeded so consistently that Saul placed him over fighting men. The promotion was accepted by the people and by Saul's own servants. Then the army returned from the victory over the Philistines. Women came out from the towns of Israel to greet King Saul with singing, dancing, tambourines, and instruments. As they celebrated, they sang that Saul had struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul heard the difference and became furious. The song credited him with thousands and David with tens of thousands. If the people were already giving David the greater honor, Saul said, what remained for David to receive except the kingdom? From that day, Saul watched him with suspicion. The next day, the harmful spirit came forcefully upon Saul, and he raved inside the house. David played the lyre as he had done before. Saul held a spear. He hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. David escaped the spear. Then Saul tried again. The music that had brought Saul relief no longer made David safe in the king's presence. Saul was afraid of him because the Lord was with David and had departed from Saul. So Saul removed David from his immediate presence and made him a commander over 1,000 men. The appointment sent David out before the people, where his success became even more visible. He led the troops in their movements, conducted himself wisely in everything Saul assigned to him, and continued to succeed because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful David was, his fear increased. But the people of Israel and Judah loved David because he led them out to battle and brought them back. Saul then offered David his eldest daughter, Merab. David was to continue fighting and prove himself courageous in the Lord's battles. But Saul intended to use the Philistines against him. Rather than striking David openly, he wanted David to die in combat. David answered by emphasizing the distance between his family and the king. Who was he, and what standing did his father's household possess in Israel, that he should become the king's son-in-law? When the time came for Merab to be given to David, she was given instead to Adriel of Meholah. Saul's younger daughter Michal loved David. When Saul was told, the news pleased him because he saw another opportunity to trap David and place him in Philistine hands. He instructed his servants to speak privately to David. They were to tell him that the king was pleased with him, that the royal servants loved him, and that he should become Saul's son-in-law. David again pointed out that he was poor and lightly esteemed. Marriage to a king's daughter required a bride price he could not provide. Saul had already decided what payment he wanted. He required no silver or other wealth from David, only evidence that David had killed 100 Philistines. The demand was intended to make David fall by Philistine hands. The servants delivered the terms, and David accepted them. Before the allotted time had passed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought the required evidence to Saul in full count so that he could become the king's son-in-law. Saul could no longer withhold the marriage. Michal became David's wife. David was now Saul's son-in-law, Jonathan's covenant friend, and one of Israel's most successful commanders. Yet every new connection inside the royal house increased Saul's alarm. Saul saw that the Lord was with David, and he knew that Michal loved him. His fear hardened into continuing hostility. Whenever the Philistine commanders came out, David achieved greater success than Saul's other officers. His name became highly respected. Saul finally abandoned concealment. He told Jonathan and all his servants that David was to be killed. Jonathan delighted greatly in David and warned him. He told David that Saul was seeking to kill him and urged him to remain hidden until morning. Jonathan would take Saul into the field where David was concealed and speak to his father. Whatever Jonathan learned, he would report. Then Jonathan defended David before the king. Saul should not sin against his servant, Jonathan argued. because David had not sinned against him. Everything David had done had benefited Saul. David had risked his life, killed the Philistine, and become the instrument of a great victory for Israel. Saul himself had seen it and rejoiced. Why should he now shed innocent blood by killing David without cause? For a time, Jonathan's appeal succeeded. Saul swore that David would not be put to death. Jonathan called David from hiding and repeated the conversation to him. Then he brought David back, and David resumed serving in Saul's presence as before. War broke out again. David went against the Philistines, struck them with such force that they fled, and returned once more as a victorious commander. Then the harmful spirit came upon Saul while he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. David was playing the lyre. Saul tried again to pin him to the wall. David slipped away, and the spear drove into the wall behind him. This time, David fled to his own house. Saul sent men to watch the house through the night and kill David in the morning. Michal knew what they were there to do. She warned her husband that if he did not escape that night, he would be dead by morning. She lowered David through a window, and he fled. Then Michal took a household image and placed it in the bed. She put goat hair near its head and covered it with clothing. When Saul's men came to seize David, she told them that he was sick. The messengers returned to Saul without him. Saul ordered them to bring David in the bed so that he could be killed. They went back inside and discovered the household image under the covering. Saul confronted his daughter. He demanded to know why she had deceived him and allowed his enemy to escape. Michal answered that David had threatened her life and forced her to let him go. David ran to Samuel at Ramah and told him everything Saul had done. Samuel took David to Naioth, where they stayed together. News reached Saul that David was there. Saul sent men to capture him. But when they saw a company of prophets prophesying with Samuel presiding over them, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's messengers, and they began prophesying too. Saul sent another group. The same thing happened. He sent a third group, and they also began to prophesy. Finally, Saul went himself. On the way, he asked where Samuel and David were and was directed to Naioth. But the Spirit of God came upon Saul as well. He continued toward Samuel while prophesying, removed his royal clothing, and lay there through that day and night. The spectacle renewed the saying, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" David escaped from Naioth and went directly to Jonathan. He demanded to know what he had done. What offense had he committed against Saul that the king was hunting him to death? Jonathan did not believe that Saul would kill him. His father did nothing important without telling him, Jonathan said. Saul would not conceal such a plan. But David answered that Saul knew Jonathan favored him and would therefore keep the plan from him. David insisted that only a step stood between him and death. Jonathan agreed to do whatever David asked. The next day was the new moon feast, when David was expected to eat with the king. David proposed that he hide in the field through the third evening. If Saul noticed his absence, Jonathan was to explain that David had urgently requested permission to attend his family's annual sacrifice at Bethlehem. Saul's response would reveal the truth. If he accepted the explanation, David would know he was safe. If Saul became furious, Jonathan would know that his father had determined to kill him. David placed his life in Jonathan's hands under the covenant between them. If David had committed an offense deserving death, Jonathan could kill him himself rather than deliver him to Saul. Jonathan rejected the thought. If he learned that Saul was determined to harm David, he would tell him. The two went into the field and agreed on a signal. Jonathan would shoot 3 arrows as though aiming at a target. Then he would send a boy to retrieve them. If Jonathan called out that the arrows were nearby, David could return safely. If he said they were beyond the boy, David must leave. Jonathan also asked David to continue showing covenant loyalty to him and his household. Their bond was to extend to their descendants. Jonathan made a covenant with David's house and had David reaffirm his love for him. David hid in the field. At the new moon feast, Saul sat in his customary place by the wall, with Jonathan present and Abner beside him. David's seat was empty. Saul said nothing on the first day, reasoning that David had become ceremonially unclean and could not attend. On the second day, David's place was still empty. Saul asked Jonathan why the son of Jesse had not come to the meal either day. Jonathan gave the agreed explanation. David had asked permission to go to Bethlehem because his family was holding a sacrifice. Saul's anger exploded against Jonathan. He accused his son of choosing David to his own shame and to the shame of his mother. As long as the son of Jesse remained alive, Saul declared, neither Jonathan nor Jonathan's kingdom would be secure. He ordered Jonathan to have David brought to him because David must die. Jonathan asked why. What had David done? Saul answered by hurling his spear at his own son. Jonathan now knew that his father had fully determined to kill David. He left the table in fierce anger and ate nothing that day. He grieved for David, whom Saul had treated with disgrace. The next morning, Jonathan went to the field with a young boy. He told the boy to run and find the arrows he shot. Jonathan sent an arrow beyond him and called out, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Then he urged the boy to hurry and not delay. The boy gathered the arrows without understanding what the signal meant. Jonathan gave him his weapons and sent him back to the city. When the boy was gone, David emerged from hiding. He bowed before Jonathan 3 times. Then the two men kissed each other and wept together, with David weeping deeply. Jonathan told him to go in peace. They had sworn friendship in the name of the Lord, and the Lord would stand between them and between their descendants. Then David rose and departed. Jonathan returned to the city. David went to Nob, where the priest Ahimelech came trembling to meet him. David was alone. No guard accompanied him, no royal unit stood behind him, and no servants carried provisions. Ahimelech asked why he had come by himself. David concealed the truth. He said that Saul had sent him on a confidential mission and had ordered him not to let anyone know the king's business. David claimed that his men were waiting at an appointed place. Then he asked the priest for food, 5 loaves, or whatever could be found. Ahimelech had no ordinary bread available. He had only the consecrated bread that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced with fresh loaves. The priest asked about the ceremonial condition of David's men. David assured him that the men had kept themselves from women. Their vessels were holy, he said, even on an ordinary journey, and all the more on that day. Ahimelech gave him the consecrated bread. One of Saul's servants was there. His name was Doeg, an Edomite and the chief of Saul's shepherds. He was detained before the Lord, and he saw David with Ahimelech. David then asked whether the priest had a spear or sword. He again used the urgency of the supposed royal mission to explain why he carried no weapon. Ahimelech had one sword, the sword of Goliath, whom David had killed in the valley of Elah. It was wrapped in cloth and placed behind the ephod. The priest told David that he could take it. "There is none like it," David said. The weapon that had once belonged to the Philistine champion now went with David as he fled from Israel's king. David crossed into Philistine territory and went to Achish, king of Gath. His reputation was recognized there. The servants of Achish identified him. They called David a king of the land and repeated the songs sung about him in Israel. Saul had struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. David took their words to heart and became very afraid of Achish. He altered his behavior in front of them and acted like a man who had lost his reason. He scratched marks on the doors of the gate and let saliva run down his beard. Achish rebuked his servants. They could see that the man was insane. Why had they brought him there? Achish had no need for more madmen in his presence. David escaped from Gath and withdrew to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and the rest of Jesse's household heard where he was, they came down to him. Others began arriving as well. Everyone in distress came. Men in debt came. Men who were bitter in spirit came. David became their commander, and the number with him grew to about 400. He was no longer fleeing alone. A company was forming around him, but its members had gathered outside the security of ordinary life in Israel. David traveled to Mizpeh in Moab and spoke directly to the king. He asked that his father and mother be allowed to stay in Moab until David knew what God would do for him. David brought them before the king of Moab, and they remained there for the entire time David stayed in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad told David not to remain there. He was to leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah. David obeyed and went into the forest of Hereth. Meanwhile, Saul sat beneath a tamarisk tree on a hill at Gibeah. His spear was in his hand, and his officials stood around him. He accused the men of his own tribe of withholding information. Would the son of Jesse give all of them fields and vineyards? Would David appoint them as commanders over thousands and hundreds? Saul demanded to know why no one had told him that Jonathan had made a covenant with David. He described that friendship as a conspiracy against him. Jonathan had stirred David up to ambush him, Saul said. No one around him grieved for him, and no one warned him. Then Doeg spoke. He had seen David at Nob with Ahimelech. He reported that the priest had inquired of the Lord for David, given him provisions, and placed Goliath's sword in his hand. Saul summoned Ahimelech and the entire priestly household at Nob. They came before the king. Saul addressed Ahimelech as the son of Ahitub. The priest answered that he was listening. Then Saul accused him of joining a conspiracy. Why had he given David food and a sword? Why had he inquired of God for him? Saul claimed that Ahimelech had helped David rise against him and lie in ambush. Ahimelech defended David by describing his known position in Saul's service. Who among all Saul's servants was as faithful as David? He was the king's son-in-law, a commander of Saul's guard, and an honored man in the royal household. Ahimelech asked whether that day had been the first time he had inquired of God for David. The king should not accuse him or his father's household. Ahimelech had known nothing about any conspiracy, great or small. Saul pronounced his sentence anyway. Ahimelech and his entire family would die. The king ordered the guards standing near him to kill the priests of the Lord. They had helped David, Saul said, and had failed to report that they knew he was fleeing. But Saul's servants refused. They would not raise their hands against the priests of the Lord. So Saul turned to Doeg. Doeg obeyed. He struck down 85 priests who wore the linen ephod. Then he attacked Nob itself, the town of the priests. Men and women, children and infants, cattle, donkeys and sheep were put to the sword. One son of Ahimelech escaped. His name was Abiathar. He fled to David and told him that Saul had slaughtered the priests. David immediately remembered seeing Doeg at Nob. He had known that day that the Edomite would report what he saw to Saul. David accepted responsibility for the death of Abiathar's family. Then he offered the surviving priest protection. Abiathar was to remain with him and not be afraid. The man seeking David's life was also seeking Abiathar's. With David, the priest would be guarded. Abiathar remained, and he had brought the ephod with him. News came that the Philistines were attacking Keilah and robbing its threshing floors. David inquired of the Lord whether he should go against them. He was told to go, strike the Philistines, and save Keilah. His men objected. They were already afraid while hiding in Judah. Going to Keilah meant moving directly against an organized Philistine force. David inquired again. The answer was clear. He was to go down to Keilah because the Philistines would be delivered into his hand. David and his men went. They fought the Philistines, inflicted heavy losses, drove away their livestock, and saved the people of Keilah. But remaining inside the fortified city placed David in a new danger. Saul learned that he had entered Keilah and believed that God had handed David over to him. The city had gates and bars. Once Saul's forces surrounded it, David would be trapped inside. Saul summoned his army to march against Keilah and besiege David and his men. David learned what he was planning and told Abiathar to bring the ephod. Then he asked whether Saul would truly come to Keilah. The answer was yes. David asked a second question. Would the leaders of Keilah surrender him and his men to Saul? Again, the answer was yes. So David left before Saul arrived. His force had now grown to about 600 men. They moved from place to place. When Saul heard that David had escaped from Keilah, he abandoned the expedition against the city. David lived in wilderness strongholds and in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul searched for him day after day, but did not capture him. During this time, Jonathan came to David at Horesh. The king's son strengthened David's confidence in God. He told him not to be afraid. Saul would not find him. David would become king over Israel, Jonathan said, and Jonathan would stand beside him. Saul himself knew this. The two men renewed their covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan returned home, while David remained in hiding. The people of Ziph went to Saul at Gibeah. They told him that David was concealed among them in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hachilah, south of the wasteland. Whenever Saul chose to come, they would help deliver David into his hands. Saul blessed them for showing concern for him, but he wanted precise information. They were to return, confirm exactly where David stayed, and learn who had seen him there. Saul said that David was known for being very cunning. Once the Ziphites had thoroughly identified his hiding places, Saul would go with them and search him out among the clans of Judah. The Ziphites returned ahead of Saul. By then, David and his men had moved farther south into the wilderness of Maon. Saul followed. Soon the king's forces were moving along one side of a mountain, while David and his men hurried along the other. Saul's troops were maneuvering to surround David and his company when a messenger arrived with urgent news. The Philistines had raided the land. Saul broke off the pursuit and turned back to confront them. The place became known as the Rock of Escape. David climbed away from the encirclement and reached the strongholds of En-Gedi. Saul was still pursuing him. When Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David was in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Saul selected 3,000 men from across Israel and went searching among the rocky slopes known as the Crags of the Wild Goats. Along the way, Saul entered a cave near some sheepfolds to relieve himself. He did not know that David and his men were concealed deep inside the same cave. David's men saw the moment as divine delivery. Here was Saul, alone and unaware, within reach of the man he had repeatedly tried to kill. They reminded David that the Lord had promised to give his enemy into his hand, so David could do with him whatever seemed good. David moved quietly towards Saul, but instead of killing him, he cut off a corner of the king's robe. Even that act struck David's conscience. He told his men that he should not have done such a thing to his master, because Saul remained the Lord's anointed. David would not raise his hand against him. His men still had weapons, and Saul was still defenseless. David restrained them and would not allow them to attack. Saul left the cave without realizing how close he had come to death. Then David stepped out and called after him, "My lord the king!" Saul turned. David bowed low with his face to the ground. He asked why Saul listened to people who said David wanted to harm him. The events inside the cave proved otherwise. Saul had been delivered into David's hand, and some had urged David to kill him. David had spared him. He held up the severed corner of Saul's robe. He had come near enough to cut it, yet Saul was alive. There was no rebellion or treason in David's hand. He had not sinned against Saul, though Saul continued hunting him. David called upon the Lord to judge between them and avenge the wrong Saul had done. But David would not take vengeance with his own hand. He quoted an old proverb, "Wickedness comes from the wicked." His own hand would not rise against the king. Then he confronted the scale of Saul's pursuit. The king of Israel had come out chasing one dead dog, one flea. David asked the Lord to examine their dispute, defend his cause, and deliver him. When David stopped speaking, Saul called back and asked whether this was truly David's voice. Then Saul wept. He admitted that David was more righteous than he was. David had repaid Saul's evil with good. Saul said that David had demonstrated this by refusing to kill him when the Lord delivered him into David's hand. A man who found his enemy did not normally send him safely away. Saul asked the Lord to reward David for what he had done. Then Saul openly acknowledged the future he had been resisting. He knew that David would surely become king and that the kingdom of Israel would be established in David's hands. Saul asked David to swear that when this happened, David would not destroy Saul's descendants or erase Saul's name from his family. David gave him the oath. Saul returned home. David and his men returned to the stronghold. During this period, Samuel died. Israel gathered to mourn him, and he was buried at his home in Ramah. David moved into the wilderness of Paran. Near Carmel lived a wealthy man named Nabal. His property was associated with Maon, and he owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. His wife Abigail was intelligent and beautiful. Nabal was harsh and badly behaved. Nabal was shearing his sheep at Carmel. David heard about it and sent 10 young men to greet him respectfully. They were to wish peace upon Nabal, his household, and everything he owned. Then they were to remind him how David's men had treated his shepherds. While the flocks were near them in Carmel, David's men had not harmed the shepherds or stolen from them. Nothing belonging to Nabal had gone missing. His own servants could confirm it. David asked Nabal to receive his men favorably and share whatever provisions he could spare. Nabal rejected the request with contempt. "Who is David?" he asked. "Who is the son of Jesse?" He compared David to one of the many servants breaking away from a master. Why should Nabal take bread, water, and meat prepared for his shearers and give them to men whose origin he did not recognize? David's messengers returned and repeated every word. David ordered his men to strap on their swords. He fastened on his own. 400 men prepared to go with him, while 200 remained with the supplies. David vowed that by morning he would leave no male alive among those belonging to Nabal. One of Nabal's servants went to Abigail. He told her that David had sent messengers from the wilderness with a blessing, but Nabal had hurled insults at them. David's men had been good to the shepherds. They had caused no harm, and nothing had disappeared while the flocks were near them. The men had protected them like a wall by night and day. The servant urged Abigail to act. Disaster had been determined against Nabal and his entire household, and Nabal was so impossible to reason with that no one could speak to him. Abigail moved quickly. She gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 prepared sheep, roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. She loaded the provisions onto donkeys and sent them ahead with her servants. She did not tell Nabal. As Abigail rode down through a concealed part of the mountain, David and his men were approaching from the opposite direction. David was still speaking about the offense. He had protected everything Nabal owned in the wilderness, and nothing had been lost. Yet Nabal had repaid good with evil. David repeated his determination to destroy the men of Nabal's household before morning. Then Abigail saw him. She quickly dismounted, fell before David, and bowed with her face to the ground. She asked him to place the blame upon her and listen. Nabal's name meant fool, she said, and foolishness was with him. She had not seen the messengers David sent. But the Lord had now restrained David from blood guilt and from taking vengeance with his own hand. Let David's enemies become like Nabal, and let David accept the gift she had brought for his men. Abigail asked forgiveness for the offense. She said that the Lord would establish an enduring house for David because David fought the Lord's battles. No evil should be found in him throughout his days. If anyone pursued David and sought his life would remain securely bound. with the Lord his God, while the lives of his enemies would be hurled away like stones from a sling. When the Lord fulfilled the good he had promised and appointed David ruler over Israel, David should not carry the grief of needless bloodshed or of avenging himself. When that future arrived, Abigail asked him to remember her. David blessed the Lord for sending Abigail. He blessed her judgment and thanked her for keeping him from blood guilt and personal vengeance. If she had not come quickly, he said, no male belonging to Nabal would have survived until morning. David accepted the provisions and told Abigail to return home in peace. He had heard her and granted her request. When Abigail reached Nabal, she found him holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk, so she told him nothing until morning. After the wine had left him, Abigail explained what had happened. Nabal's heart failed within him, and he became like stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. When David heard, he praised the Lord for judging the insult and for keeping him from doing evil with his own hands. Then David sent messengers to ask Abigail to become his wife. She bowed with her face to the ground and answered that she was ready to serve, even to wash the feet of David's servants. Abigail quickly mounted a donkey and went with the messengers, accompanied by 5 female attendants. She became David's wife. David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel. Saul, meanwhile, had given Michal, David's wife and Saul's daughter, to another man named Palti. The Ziphites again went to Saul. They reported that David was hiding on the hill of Hachilah near the wilderness. Saul returned with 3,000 chosen men of Israel. He camped beside the road, while David remained in the wilderness. When David learned that Saul had followed him there, he sent out scouts and confirmed Saul's arrival. Then David approached the camp and saw where Saul slept. Abner and the army were positioned around him, with Saul in the center. David asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, the brother of Joab, who would go down with him into the camp. Abishai volunteered. That night, David and Abishai entered the camp. Saul was asleep, with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head and his water jar nearby. Abner and the soldiers slept around him. A deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Abishai saw a perfect opportunity. God had delivered David's enemy into his hand. He asked permission to pin Saul to the ground with one thrust of the spear. He would not need to strike twice. David refused. Who could raise a hand against the Lord's anointed and remain innocent? Saul's death would come by the Lord's action, whether the Lord struck him, his appointed day arrived, or he died in battle. David would not kill him. Instead, they took the spear and water jar from beside Saul's head and left. No one saw them. No one awakened. David crossed to the opposite side and stood on a distant hill. Then he called out to the army and to Abner. He rebuked the commander for failing to guard the king. Someone had entered the camp to destroy Saul. Abner and his men deserved death for leaving the Lord's anointed unprotected. Then David told him to look for the king's spear and water jar. Saul recognized David's voice and called to him. David again asked why the king was pursuing him. What evil had he done? If the Lord had stirred Saul against him, David said, an offering should be accepted. But if men had driven Saul to this, they were cursed, because they were forcing David away from his place among the Lord's people. The king of Israel was hunting one flea, as if pursuing a partridge through the mountains. Saul confessed that he had sinned. He asked David to return and promised not to harm him, because David had treated Saul's life as precious. Saul admitted that he had acted foolishly and made a terrible error. David did not come down. He told Saul to send a young man across to retrieve the spear. The Lord would repay each person for righteousness and faithfulness. David had been given the chance to kill the Lord's anointed, and he had refused. As David had valued Saul's life, he asked that his own life be valued and delivered from danger. Saul blessed him and declared that David would accomplish great things and prevail. Then Saul went home. David went his own way, yet David no longer trusted Saul's promises. He said to himself that one day Saul would destroy him. The only secure escape was to leave Israelite territory and live among the Philistines. Once Saul knew that David was beyond Israel's borders, he would stop searching for him. David crossed over with his 600 men and entered the service of Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. Each man brought his household. David brought Ahinoam and Abigail. When Saul learned that David had fled to Gath, he ended the pursuit. David asked Achish for a place in one of the country towns. There was no reason, he said, for the king's servant to live in the royal city. Achish gave him Ziklag, which remained associated with the kings of Judah from that time onward. David lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. From Ziklag, David attacked the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. These peoples occupied territory extending toward Egypt. David left no survivors in the places he struck. He took sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels, clothing, and other goods, then returned to Achish. When Achish asked where he had raided, David named areas belonging to Judah, the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites. Because David left no one alive to reach Gath and report what had actually happened, Achish accepted the deception. Achish concluded that David had made himself detestable to Israel and would therefore remain his servant permanently. Then the Philistines gathered their forces for a major campaign against Israel. Achish told David that he and his men would accompany the Philistine army. David answered that Achish would now see what his servant could do. Achish responded by appointing David his bodyguard for life. At the same time, Saul faced the approaching Philistine force without Samuel and without the guidance he had once received. Samuel was dead and buried at Ramah. Saul himself had expelled mediums and spiritists from the land. The Philistines assembled at Shunem. Saul gathered Israel and camped on Mount Gilboa. When he saw the Philistine army, fear seized him. Saul inquired of the Lord but received no answer, neither through dreams, nor through the Urim, nor through prophets. So Saul ordered his servants to find a woman who could consult the dead. They told him that such a woman lived at Endor. Saul removed his royal clothing and disguised himself. After dark, he went to the woman with 2 men and asked her to bring up the person he named. The woman warned him that Saul had removed mediums from Israel. Why was this stranger setting a trap that would lead to her death? Saul swore by the Lord that she would not be punished. Then she asked whom he wanted to summon. Samuel, he answered. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out and realized that the disguised visitor was Saul. She demanded to know why he had deceived her. Saul told her not to be afraid and asked what she saw. She described a figure rising from the earth, an old man wrapped in a robe. Saul understood that it was Samuel. He bowed with his face to the ground. Samuel asked why Saul had disturbed him. Saul described his desperation. The Philistines were making war against him. God had turned away from him, and no answer came through prophets or dreams. Saul had called for Samuel to tell him what to do, but the word Samuel gave was not a path of escape. If the Lord had departed from Saul and become his enemy, Samuel asked, why seek an answer from him? The judgment already announced was now being carried out. The kingdom was being torn from Saul's hand and given to another, to David. Samuel connected the coming disaster to Saul's refusal to obey the command concerning Amalek. The Lord would deliver Israel's army into Philistine hands. Saul and his sons would die, and the Israelite camp would fall. Saul collapsed full length on the ground. He had eaten nothing all day or night, and Samuel's words left him terrified and without strength. The woman approached and saw his condition. She reminded Saul that she had risked her life by obeying him. Now he should listen to her and eat so that he would have strength for the journey. Saul initially refused. His servants joined the woman in urging him until he agreed. She quickly slaughtered a fattened calf and prepared unleavened bread from flour. Saul and his servants ate, then rose and left during the night. While Saul returned toward the army awaiting battle, David marched with the army preparing to attack him. The Philistine forces assembled at Aphek, while Israel camped near the spring in Jezreel. The Philistine rulers passed in units of hundreds and thousands. David and his men came at the rear with Achish. The other Philistine commanders immediately objected. "What are these Hebrews doing here?" they demanded. Achish defended David. He explained that David had once served Saul, but had now been with Achish for more than a year. Achish claimed to have found no fault in him since the day he defected. The commanders were not persuaded. They ordered Achish to send David back to the place assigned to him. David could not go into battle with them. In the fighting, he could turn against the Philistines and reconcile himself to Saul with Philistine blood. They also recognized David's reputation. This was the man celebrated in Israel's dances. Saul had struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Achish called David and declared that he considered him dependable. He would gladly take David into battle, but the Philistine rulers did not approve. David must return peacefully and do nothing to offend them. David protested. What had he done? What fault had Achish found in him that he could not go fight the enemies of his lord the king? Achish answered that David had been as blameless in his sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders had said he could not accompany them. David and his men rose early and returned toward Philistine territory. The Philistine army continued toward Jezreel. 3 days later, David reached Ziklag. The town had been burned. While David and his men were away, Amalekite raiders had attacked the Negev and Ziklag. They had taken everyone captive, including the women and children, but had killed no one. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, were among the captives. When the men saw what had happened, they wept until they had no strength left to weep. Then grief turned against David. The men spoke of stoning him because their sons and daughters had been taken. David was in severe distress, but he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He called for Abiathar to bring the ephod and inquired of the Lord. Should he pursue the raiders? Would he overtake them? The answer came, pursue them. David would overtake the raiders and recover everything. All 600 men set out. When they reached the Besor Valley, 200 were too exhausted to cross. David left them there and continued with 400. His men found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. They gave him bread, water, a piece of fig cake, and clusters of raisins. He had eaten no food and drunk no water for 3 days and nights. After eating, his strength returned. David asked who he belonged to and where he came from. The young man said that he was an Egyptian slave belonging to an Amalekite. His master had abandoned him when he became sick 3 days earlier. The raiding force had attacked the territory of the Cherethites, Judah and Caleb, and had burned Ziklag. David asked whether he could lead them to the raiders. The Egyptian demanded an oath that David would neither kill him nor return him to his master. With that assurance, he led David to the Amalekite camp. The raiders were scattered across the ground, eating, drinking, and celebrating the enormous quantity of plunder they had taken from Philistine and Israelite territory. David attacked. The fighting continued from twilight into the following evening. Only 400 young men escaped by riding away on camels. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. His 2 wives were rescued. Nothing was missing, neither children nor adults, sons nor daughters, plunder nor anything else carried away from Ziklag. David brought it all back. He also took the Amalekites' flocks and herds. These were driven ahead of the other livestock and identified as David's plunder. When David returned to the Besor Valley, the 200 men, who had been too exhausted to continue, came out to meet him. Some of the men who had fought with David did not want to share the recovered goods. Those who stayed behind could have their wives and children, they said, but nothing else. David refused. The victory and recovery had been given by the Lord. The men who guarded the supplies would receive the same share as those who entered the battle. David made this a rule and practice in Israel. From the plunder, he sent gifts to the elders of Judah and to friends in the places where he and his men had traveled. He described the gifts as a share from the enemies of the Lord. While David restored the families of his men and renewed ties within Judah, the Philistines attacked Saul's army. The Israelites fled and fell on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons. Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua were killed. The fighting closed around Saul. Philistine archers found him and wounded him severely. Saul ordered his armor-bearer to draw his sword and kill him. He did not want the Philistines to capture and abuse him, but the armor-bearer was terrified and refused. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword. Saul, 3 of his sons, his armor-bearer, and his men died that day. The Israelites living nearby saw the army's defeat and abandoned their towns. The Philistines entered and occupied them. The next day, the Philistines came to strip the dead. They found Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, removed his armor, and sent the news throughout Philistine territory. His armor was placed in a temple, and his body was fastened to the wall of Beth-shan. Across the Jordan, the people of Jabesh-Gilead heard what had been done. Their warriors traveled through the night, removed the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall, and carried them back to Jabesh. They burned the bodies there, buried the bones beneath a tamarisk tree, and fasted for 7 days. Saul was dead, Jonathan was dead, and Israel's throne stood empty. 2 days after David returned to Ziklag, a man arrived from Saul's camp. His clothes were torn, and dirt covered his head. He fell before David and bowed. David asked where he had come from. The man said that he had escaped from Israel's camp. David asked what had happened. The man reported that Israel had fled from the battle, many soldiers had fallen, and Saul and Jonathan were dead. "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan are dead?" David asked. The man claimed that he had come upon Saul on Mount Gilboa, leaning on his spear while enemy chariots and horsemen closed in. Saul had looked back, seen him, and called him over. Saul asked who he was. When the man identified himself as an Amalekite, Saul ordered him to stand over him and kill him because he was in agony but still alive. The Amalekite said that he killed Saul because he knew the king could not survive. Then he produced Saul's crown and the bracelet from his arm and gave them to David. David tore his clothes. His men did the same. They mourned, wept, and fasted until evening for Saul, Jonathan, the people of the Lord, and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Then David questioned the messenger again. He asked where he was from. The man answered that he was the son of an Amalekite, living as a resident foreigner in Israel. David asked why he had not been afraid to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Then he called one of his young men and ordered him to strike the Amalekite down. The sentence rested on the man's own testimony. His blood was on his own head, David said, because his mouth had declared that he killed the Lord's anointed. David composed a lament for Saul and Jonathan and ordered that it be taught to the people of Judah. It became known as the Lament of the Bow. He called Saul and Jonathan the glory of Israel, fallen on the heights. He pleaded that the news not be proclaimed in Gath or celebrated in Philistine cities. David called upon the mountains of Gilboa to remain without rain or dew, because Saul's shield lay there defiled. He remembered the bow of Jonathan and the sword of Saul as weapons that did not return empty from battle. Saul and Jonathan had been loved and admired, joined in life and not divided in death, swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. David called upon Israel's daughters to weep for Saul, who had clothed them in rich garments and ornaments. Then the lament narrowed to Jonathan. David called him his brother. He grieved deeply for him and described Jonathan's love as extraordinary. Again and again, the same cry returned, how the mighty had fallen. After mourning, David inquired of the Lord. He asked whether he should go up into one of the towns of Judah. He was told to go. David asked which town, and the answer was Hebron. So David went with Ahinoam and Abigail. His 600 men brought their households, and they settled in Hebron and the surrounding towns. There the men of Judah anointed David as king over the tribe of Judah, but the other tribes had not accepted him. When David was told that the men of Jabesh-Gilead had buried Saul, he sent them a message of blessing. They had shown loyalty to their Lord by recovering and burying him. David asked that the Lord show them faithful love, and he promised to treat them well for what they had done. Then he told them to be strong. Saul was dead, and Judah had anointed David as king. Abner, Saul's military commander, established another king. He took Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth across the Jordan to Mahanaim and made him king over Gilead, the Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and the rest of Israel. Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 2 years. David remained king over Judah at Hebron for 7 years and 6 months. The two sides soon met at Gibeon. Abner led Ishbosheth's servants to one side of the pool. Joab brought David's servants to the other. Abner proposed a contest between young warriors, and Joab agreed. 12 men from Benjamin and Ishbosheth's side faced 12 of David's servants. Each seized his opponent by the head and drove a sword into his side. All 24 fell together. The contest became a fierce battle, and David's men defeated Abner and the army of Israel. Joab's brother Asahel pursued Abner without turning aside. Asahel was exceptionally fast. Abner looked back and asked whether it was Asahel. "It is," Asahel answered. Abner urged him to stop following. He told him to turn against one of the younger soldiers and take that man's armor. Asahel refused. Abner warned him again. If he struck Asahel down, how could he face Joab afterward? Asahel continued the pursuit. Abner thrust backward with the butt of his spear. It entered Asahel's abdomen and came out through his back. Asahel fell and died where he stood. Everyone who reached the place stopped when they saw him. Joab and Abishai continued chasing Abner until sunset. By then, the surviving Benjaminites had gathered around Abner on a hill. Abner called to Joab, "Must the sword keep devouring forever?" Did Joab not understand that the result would be bitterness? When would he tell his men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites? Joab sounded the trumpet. His men stopped, and the two forces separated. Abner and his men traveled through the night toward Mahanaim. Joab gathered his troops. 19 of David's servants were missing in addition to Asahel, while David's men had killed 360 from Benjamin and Abner's force. They carried Asahel's body to Bethlehem and buried him in his father's tomb. Then Joab and his men traveled through the night and reached Hebron at daybreak. The war between David's house and Saul's house lasted a long time. David's position grew stronger, while Saul's house grew weaker. 6 sons were born to David in Hebron. The eldest was Amnon. Abigail bore Chileab. Maachah bore Absalom. Haggith bore Adonijah. Abital bore Shephatiah. And Eglah bore Ithream. Within Ishbosheth's kingdom, Abner became increasingly powerful. Then Ishbosheth accused him concerning Rizpah, one of Saul's concubines. Abner reacted with fury. He demanded to know whether Ishbosheth regarded him as a dog's head belonging to Judah. Abner had maintained loyalty to Saul's house and had not handed Ishbosheth over to David. Yet now Ishbosheth accused him concerning a woman. Abner swore that he would transfer the kingdom from Saul's house to David. David's throne would be established over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Ishbosheth could not answer because he was afraid of Abner. Abner sent messengers to David offering a covenant. If David made an agreement with him, Abner would help bring all Israel to David's side. David accepted on one condition: Michal must be returned to him. He sent the demand directly to Ishbosheth, reminding him of the bride price he had paid for Saul's daughter. Ishbosheth had Michal taken from her husband, Paltiel. Paltiel followed her weeping as far as Bahurim until Abner ordered him to return home. Abner then spoke with Israel's elders. They had wanted David as king before, he told them, and now they should act. He reminded them that the Lord had spoken of saving Israel through David. Abner also spoke privately with Benjamin. Then he came to Hebron with 20 men and reported everything Israel and Benjamin were prepared to do. David held a feast for them. Abner proposed gathering all Israel so the tribes could make a covenant with David and place him over the nation. David sent him away in peace. Soon afterward, Joab returned from a raid and learned that Abner had been in Hebron. He confronted David. Why had the king allowed Abner to leave? Joab accused Abner of coming to deceive David and learn his movements. Without David's knowledge, Joab sent messengers after Abner. They brought him back from the well of Sirah. Joab took Abner aside near the city gate as though speaking privately. There he stabbed him in the abdomen, killing him in revenge for Asahel. When David heard, he declared himself and his kingdom innocent before the Lord of Abner's blood. He placed responsibility on Joab's house and ordered Joab and all the people to mourn. Abner was buried at Hebron. David walked behind the funeral bier and wept at the tomb. He lamented that Abner had not died like a criminal. His hands had not been bound, nor his feet chained. He had fallen as a man falls before the wicked. The people urged David to eat, but he swore that he would taste nothing before sunset. His public grief convinced Israel that he had not ordered Abner's death. David told his servants that a prince and a great man had fallen in Israel. Though he was the anointed king, he lacked the power to control the sons of Zeruiah. When Ishbosheth heard that Abner had died, he lost courage, and Israel was alarmed. Jonathan had left a son named Mephibosheth. He had been 5 years old when the news of Saul and Jonathan's deaths arrived. His nurse picked him up and fled, but in her haste he fell and became disabled in both feet. Ishbosheth had 2 raiding commanders named Rechab and Baanah, sons of Rimmon from Beeroth. They entered Ishbosheth's house during the heat of the day while he rested. They stabbed him in the abdomen, cut off his head, and escaped across the Jordan Valley. They carried the head to David at Hebron and presented it as proof that Saul's house had been avenged. David answered by recalling the messenger who claimed to have killed Saul and expected good news. David had executed that man. How much more then when wicked men murdered a righteous man in his own house and on his own bed? David ordered Rechab and Baanah killed. Their hands and feet were cut off, and their bodies were displayed beside the pool at Hebron. Ishbosheth's head was buried in Abner's tomb. Saul's surviving regime had lost both its king and its commander. Then all the tribes came to David at Hebron. They identified themselves as his own flesh and blood. Even while Saul was king, they said, David had been the one leading Israel out to battle and bringing the army home. They also recognized the word spoken over him. David was to shepherd Israel and become its ruler. The elders made a covenant with David before the Lord, and they anointed him king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. He ruled for 40 years, 7 years and 6 months over Judah from Hebron, then 33 years over Israel and Judah from Jerusalem. David went with his men to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites told him that he would never enter the city. They claimed that even the blind and lame could keep him out. David captured the stronghold of Zion. It became known as the City of David. He occupied the stronghold and built outward from the supporting terraces. His power continued to grow because the Lord God of hosts was with him. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David, along with cedar timber, carpenters, and stonemasons. They built a palace for him. David recognized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of the people. His household also expanded in Jerusalem. David took additional wives and concubines, and more sons and daughters were born to him. Among the sons born there were Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. When the Philistines heard that Israel had anointed David as king, they mobilized to find him. David learned of their movement and went down to the stronghold. The Philistine forces spread through the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of the Lord, should he attack them? Would they be delivered into his hand? He was told to go, because the Philistines would be given to him. David struck them at Baal-perazim. He compared the victory to water breaking through a barrier. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. The Philistines returned and again spread through the valley. David inquired once more, but this time he received different instructions. He was not to advance directly. He was to circle behind them and approach near the balsam trees. When he heard the sound of marching in the treetops, he was to move quickly, because the Lord had gone ahead to strike the Philistine army. David followed the command. He drove the Philistines back from Geba as far as Gezer. David then gathered 30,000 chosen men from Israel and went to bring the ark of God from Baal, Judah. The ark carried the name of the Lord of hosts, who was enthroned between the cherubim. They placed it on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab. Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio, guided the cart. David and the people celebrated before the Lord with songs and instruments. Then they reached the threshing floor of Nachon. The oxen stumbled, and Uzzah reached out to steady the ark. He took hold of it. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah for the irreverent act, and he died there beside the ark. David became angry over what had happened, and the place became known as Perez Uzzah, the outbreak against Uzzah. Then David became afraid of the Lord. "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" he asked. He would not move it into the city of David. Instead, the ark was taken to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. It remained there for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. When David was told about that blessing, he went to bring the ark into Jerusalem with rejoicing. This time, men carried it. After the bearers had taken 6 steps, David sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. Then the procession continued. David danced before the Lord with all his strength, wearing a linen ephod. Israel brought up the ark with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. As the ark entered the city of David, Michal looked down from a window. She saw the king leaping and dancing, and she despised him in her heart. The ark was placed inside the tent David had prepared. He presented burnt offerings and peace offerings, blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed food to every man and woman in the assembly. When the celebration ended, the people returned to their homes. David went home to bless his own household. Michal came out to meet him with contempt. She mocked the way the king of Israel had distinguished himself, exposing himself before the servant girls as a shameless man would do. David answered that he had danced before the Lord, who had chosen him over Michal's father and Saul's entire house, and appointed him ruler over Israel. David would celebrate before the Lord. He was willing to humble himself even further, and the servant women Michal mentioned would honor him. Michal remained childless until her death. David lived in his palace, and the Lord gave him rest from the enemies around him. The king spoke to the prophet Nathan. David pointed to the contrast. He lived in a cedar house, while the ark of God remained inside a tent. Nathan told him to do what was in his heart, because the Lord was with him. But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. David was not to assume that he would build a house for God. Since bringing Israel out of Egypt, the Lord had not lived in a permanent structure. The ark had moved in a tent and tabernacle. During those years, God had not demanded that Israel's leaders build a cedar house. Nathan was to tell David what the Lord had already done for him. God had taken him from the pasture, from following sheep, and made him ruler over Israel. He had been with David wherever he went and had cut down his enemies before him. David's name would be made great. Israel would be given a secure place and planted so the people would no longer be disturbed as they had been under violent oppressors. Then the promise turned from the house David wanted to build to the house God would establish. The Lord would make a house for David. David had been thinking of cedar walls for the ark. God's promise concerned a royal line. When David's days were complete and he rested with his ancestors, one of his own descendants would rise after him. His kingdom would be established. That son would build a house for the Lord's name, and the throne of his kingdom would be established forever. God would be a father to David's descendant, and David's descendant would be God's son. When David's descendant did wrong, he would be disciplined through human agents. But the steadfast love shown to David would not be withdrawn as it had been withdrawn from Saul. David's house, kingdom, and throne would endure. Nathan reported every word of the vision to David. David entered the tent and sat before the Lord. "Who am I, Lord God?" he asked, "and what is my house that you have brought me this far?" What had already been given was treated as small compared with the promise extending into the future. God had spoken about David's house for a long time to come. David asked what more he could say. God knew his servant, and the promise rested upon God's word and purpose. David declared that no one was like the Lord, and that there was no God besides him. Then he connected the promise concerning his house to Israel. No other nation was like the people God had redeemed from Egypt and made his own. God had established Israel as his people, and the Lord had become their God. Now David asked that the word concerning his house be confirmed forever. Let the Lord's name be magnified, and let David's house be established before him. David said that he had found courage to pray because God had first revealed the promise. The Lord's words were true. He had promised this good thing to his servant. Therefore David asked him to bless his house so that it would continue forever. David's authority expanded beyond Jerusalem. He defeated the Philistines and took control of Metheg-Ammah, breaking their hold over Israel. He also defeated Moab. The captured Moabites were made to lie on the ground and were measured with cords. 2 measured groups were put to death, while 1 measured group was spared. Those who remained became subject to David and paid tribute. To the north, David fought Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. Hadadezer had gone to restore his control near the Euphrates. David captured 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. He disabled the chariot horses except for enough to pull 100 chariots. Arameans from Damascus came to help Hadadezer. David struck down 22,000 of them and placed garrisons throughout their territory. The Arameans became subject to him and paid tribute. The attempt to strengthen Hadadezer had instead placed Damascus under David's control. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields carried by Hadadezer's officers and brought them to Jerusalem. From Hadadezer's towns of Beta and Berothai, he took a large quantity of bronze. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated Hadadezer's army, he sent his son Joram to greet and congratulate him. Toi and Hadadezer had been at war. Joram brought David objects of silver, gold, and bronze. David dedicated these gifts to the Lord, along with the silver and gold taken from the nations he had subdued: Edom, Moab, Ammon, the Philistines, Amalek, and the kingdom of Zobah. The wealth taken through conquest and received through diplomacy was gathered at Jerusalem and dedicated rather than treated only as personal royal property. David's name became widely known after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He established garrisons throughout Edom, and the Edomites became his servants. Again, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David now held authority across the surrounding territories. Philistia had been subdued to the west. Moab paid tribute from the east. Edom was occupied to the south. And Aramean territory in the north held David's garrisons. He also governed within Israel. David reigned over the entire nation and administered justice and equity for his people. Joab commanded the army. Jehoshaphat served as recorder. Zadok and Ahimelech served as priests, and Sariah was secretary. Benaiah commanded the Cherethites and Pelethites, the forces serving nearest the king. David's sons held leading positions in royal service. The kingdom possessed commanders for its armies, officials for royal administration, priests for worship, and an organized court under David's rule. Then David asked whether anyone remained from Saul's family to whom he could show kindness for Jonathan's sake. A former servant of Saul named Ziba was brought before him. The king addressed him by name. Ziba answered, "I am your servant." David asked whether anyone from Saul's house was still alive. He wanted to show that person the kindness of God. Ziba told him that one of Jonathan's sons remained. Both of the man's feet were disabled. David asked where he was. Jonathan's son was living in the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodebar. Jonathan's surviving son was named Mephibosheth. David sent for him from Machir's house. Mephibosheth entered the king's presence and fell face down before him. David spoke his name, Mephibosheth. He answered, "I am your servant." David told him not to be afraid. For Jonathan's sake, David would show him kindness. All the land that had belonged to Saul would be restored to him, and Mephibosheth would always eat at David's table. The promise gave Mephibosheth both property from his grandfather's household and a permanent place in the king's presence. Mephibosheth bowed again. "What is your servant," he asked, "that you should notice a dead dog like me?" David summoned Ziba and told him what had been decided. Everything that had belonged to Saul and his household was now given to Jonathan's son. David ordered Ziba, his sons, and his servants to cultivate the land and bring in its produce for Mephibosheth. Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. He agreed to carry out everything David had ordered. Mephibosheth himself would eat continually at the king's table like one of David's sons. He moved to Jerusalem and lived near the king. He had a young son named Micah, and everyone in Ziba's household became Mephibosheth's servants. Mephibosheth ate regularly at David's table, and he was disabled in both feet. Then Nahash, king of the Ammonites, died, and his son Hanun succeeded him. David said that he would show kindness to Hanun because Nahash had shown kindness to him. He sent a delegation to express sympathy over the death of Hanun's father. The Ammonite officials questioned the purpose of the visit. They asked Hanun whether he truly believed David had sent men merely to honor his father. They described the envoys as spies who had come to examine the city, inspect it, and prepare for its overthrow. Hanun seized David's servants. He shaved off half of each man's beard, cut away their clothing at the hips, and sent them away. When David learned what had happened, he sent messengers to meet them because the men were deeply humiliated. He instructed them to remain at Jericho until their beards had grown back. Only then were they to return to Jerusalem. The delegation David had sent to express kindness had returned mutilated and publicly disgraced. The Ammonites recognized that they had made themselves detestable to David. They hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob and Zobah. They also hired 1,000 men from the king of Makkah and 12,000 from Tob. The insult to David's envoys had now produced a coalition of Ammonite and hired Aramean forces. David sent Joab with the entire army and Israel's strongest warriors. The Ammonites formed their battle line at the entrance to their city. The allied Aramean forces positioned themselves separately in the open country. Joab saw that enemy forces stood in front of him and behind him. He selected some of Israel's best men and placed them under his own command against the Arameans. He put the remaining troops under Abishai to face the Ammonites. The brothers agreed to support each other. If the Arameans proved too strong for Joab, Abishai would come to his aid. If the Ammonites overpowered Abishai, Joab would help him. Then Joab called for courage. They were to be strong for their people and for the cities of their God. The Lord would do what seemed good to him. Joab and the troops with him advanced against the Arameans. The Arameans fled. When the Ammonites saw their allies retreating, they also fled from Abishai and withdrew into the city. Joab did not complete the war. He returned to Jerusalem. The Arameans regrouped after recognizing that Israel had defeated them. Hadadezer summoned forces from beyond the Euphrates and brought them to Helam. He placed them under the command of Shobach. This second force drew David himself into the campaign. When David received the report, he assembled all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. The Arameans formed their battle line and fought him. They fled before Israel. David's army killed 700 charioteers and 40,000 horsemen. Shobach, the commander of the Aramean army, was struck down and died there. The kings who had served Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated. They made peace with Israel and became subject to David. After that loss, the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites again. The coalition behind Hanun had been broken. Israel's commanders had survived a battle on two fronts, and David had defeated the larger force summoned from beyond the Euphrates. David stood at the height of military and royal power. The conflict with Ammon itself remained unfinished. When the campaigning season returned, David sent Joab, his officers, and the entire army of Israel against the Ammonites. They devastated the Ammonite territory and besieged Rabbah. David remained in Jerusalem. One evening he rose from his bed and walked on the roof of the palace. From there he saw a woman bathing. She was very beautiful. David sent someone to find out who she was. The answer identified her by both family and marriage. She was Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. David sent messengers to bring her to him. She came to the palace, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then Bathsheba returned home. She became pregnant and sent word to David. "I am pregnant." David immediately sent an order to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." Joab obeyed. When Uriah arrived, David asked how Joab was doing, how the soldiers were doing, and how the war was progressing. Then he told Uriah to go home and wash his feet. Uriah left the palace, and a gift of food from the king followed him. But Uriah did not go home. He slept at the entrance to the palace with the king's other servants. When David was told, he questioned him. Uriah had just returned from a journey. Why had he not gone down to his house? Uriah answered by naming everything that kept him from doing so. The ark, Israel, and Judah were staying in temporary shelters. Joab and David's soldiers were camped in open country. How could Uriah go to his house, eat, drink, and sleep with his wife, while the others remained in those conditions? He swore by David's life that he would not do it. David told Uriah to remain in Jerusalem one more day. After that, David said he would send him back. Uriah stayed that day and the next. David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. But that evening Uriah again slept among the king's servants. He did not go home. David had summoned Uriah from the battlefield, sent him toward his house, kept him for another day, and brought him to the royal table. None of those actions placed Uriah in his own home with Bathsheba. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab. He placed it in Uriah's hand to carry. The letter ordered Joab to put Uriah at the front, where the fighting was fiercest. Then the other soldiers were to withdraw from him so that he would be struck down and die. Joab was already watching the defenses of Rabbah. He knew where the Ammonites had their strongest fighters, so he assigned Uriah to that position. The men of Rabbah came out against Joab's forces. Some of David's soldiers fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed. Joab sent a messenger to report everything that had happened in the battle. He anticipated that David might become angry when he heard that the soldiers had approached so close to the city wall. Joab instructed the messenger carefully. If the king asked why the troops had gone so near the wall, he might mention the death of Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth. A woman at Thebez had dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech from a tower and killed him. Why, David might ask, had Joab's soldiers exposed themselves to the same kind of danger? If the king responded that way, the messenger was to add one final detail. Uriah the Hittite was dead. The messenger arrived and reported that the defenders had launched a strong attack against Israel in the open country. David's troops had driven them back toward the entrance to the city. Then archers fired from the wall. Some of David's servants had died. And your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. David did not rebuke Joab. He told the messenger to encourage him. Joab should not let the outcome trouble him, because the sword devoured one person and then another. He should intensify the attack, overthrow the city, and be encouraged. When Bathsheba heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the period of mourning ended, David brought her into his house. She became his wife and gave birth to a son. What David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord sent Nathan to him. The prophet told David about two men living in the same town. One was rich. He owned a great number of sheep and cattle. The other was poor. He owned nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it inside his household. It grew up with his children, ate from his food, drank from his cup, and rested in his arms. The lamb was like a daughter to him. A traveler came to the rich man. The rich man refused to take an animal from his own abundant flocks to prepare a meal. Instead, he seized the poor man's one lamb and prepared it for the traveler. David burned with anger. The man deserved to die, he declared. He must repay 4 times the value of the lamb because he had done such a thing without pity. Nathan answered, "You are the man." Then he delivered the Lord's charge against David. The Lord had anointed David king over Israel and delivered him from Saul. He had given David the royal household and authority over Israel and Judah. If that had been too little, more would have been given. Why then had David despised the Lord's command by doing evil? Nathan named the actions directly. David had struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. He had taken Uriah's wife. He had killed Uriah through the sword of the Ammonites. The sentence would reach David's own house. The sword would never depart from it. Calamity would rise against David from within his family. Another man would take David's wives before his eyes. What David had done secretly would return upon his household publicly, before Israel and under the open sun. David said, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan told him that his sin had been put away and that he would not die. But because David's act had shown contempt for the Lord, the son born to Bathsheba would die. Then Nathan returned home. The child became gravely ill. David pleaded with God for him. He fasted and spent the nights lying on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him and tried to raise him, but he refused. He would not eat with them. On the 7th day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell him. While the child was alive, David had refused to listen when they spoke. They said to one another that if they announced the death, David might harm himself. David noticed them whispering and understood what had happened. "Is the child dead?" he asked. They told him that he was. David rose from the ground. He washed, applied oil, and changed his clothes. Then he entered the house of the Lord and worshipped. Afterward, he returned home and asked for food. His servants served him, and he ate. They could not understand the reversal. While the child lived, David had fasted and wept. Now that the child was dead, he had risen and eaten. David explained that while the child remained alive, he fasted because the Lord could still be gracious and let him live. But now the child was dead. Fasting could not bring him back. "I will go to him," David said, "but he will not return to me." David then comforted Bathsheba. They had another son, and David named him Solomon. The Lord loved the child. He sent word through Nathan that Solomon was also to be called Jedidiah, meaning beloved of the Lord. At Rabbah, Joab continued the war. He captured the royal citadel and gained control of the city's water supply. Then he sent word to David. Joab had taken the waterworks, but David should gather the remaining troops, camp against the city, and complete its capture himself. Otherwise, Joab would take the city, and it would be called by his name. David assembled the army, went to Rabbah, fought against it, and captured it. He removed the crown from the Ammonite king. It was made of gold, set with a precious stone, and weighed a talent. The crown was placed on David's head. He also carried away a great quantity of plunder. David brought out the inhabitants and subjected them to labor with saws, iron tools, axes, and brickmaking. He did the same to the other Ammonite cities. Then David and the entire army returned to Jerusalem. The external war had ended, but the sword Nathan had spoken about was now directed toward David's own house. Amnon, David's eldest son, became consumed with desire for Tamar. Tamar was beautiful. She was his half-sister, the daughter of David and Maacah, and the full sister of Absalom. Amnon became so frustrated that he made himself ill. Tamar was a virgin, and he saw no way to act toward her. Amnon had a cousin and friend named Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shimeah. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He asked why a king's son looked increasingly miserable each morning. Amnon told him that he loved Tamar, the sister of his brother Absalom. Jonadab gave him a plan. Amnon was to lie in bed and pretend to be ill. When David came to see him, Amnon should ask that Tamar be sent to prepare food in his presence and feed it to him by hand. Amnon followed the advice. When David visited, Amnon requested that his sister come and make special cakes where he could watch. David sent word to Tamar, telling her to go to Amnon's house and prepare food for him. Tamar obeyed her father. She went to Amnon, who was lying in bed. She took dough, kneaded it, shaped the cakes in front of him, and cooked them. Then she brought the pan and served him. Amnon refused to eat. He ordered everyone else out of the house. Once they were gone, he told Tamar to bring the food into his private room and feed him there. She carried the cakes to him. Amnon seized her and told her to come to bed with him. Tamar refused. She called him her brother and begged him not to force her. Such a thing was not to be done in Israel. It was a disgrace. She asked where she could carry the shame afterward. Amnon himself would be regarded as one of Israel's fools. Tamar urged him to speak to the king rather than commit this act. David would not withhold her from him, she said. Amnon would not listen. He was stronger than Tamar, and he raped her. Then the desire he had called love turned into intense hatred. The hatred he felt afterward was greater than the desire he had expressed before. "Get up and leave," he told her. Tamar protested again. Sending her away compounded the wrong already done to her. Amnon refused to listen. He called his personal servant and ordered him to put Tamar outside and bolt the door behind her. She was wearing the richly ornamented robe worn by the king's unmarried daughters. Tamar put ashes on her head, tore the robe, placed her hand upon her head, and went away crying aloud. Absalom saw her condition and asked whether Amnon had been with her. He told her to remain silent for the moment because Amnon was her brother and not to take the matter to heart. Tamar lived as a desolate woman in Absalom's house. David heard what had happened and became furious. He did not punish Amnon in the sequence that followed. Absalom said nothing to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated him because he had violated Tamar. 2 full years passed. Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Baal-hazor near Ephraim, and he invited all the king's sons to a feast. He also went to David and invited the king and his servants. David declined. If the entire royal household attended, he said, they would become a burden. Absalom pressed him, but David still would not go. He gave Absalom his blessing instead. Then Absalom made a specific request. If the king would not attend, let Amnon come with them. David asked why Amnon needed to go. Absalom continued pressing until David allowed Amnon and the other royal sons to attend. Before the feast, Absalom commanded his servants to watch Amnon. When Amnon was relaxed from drinking wine, Absalom would give the signal. They were to strike him down and kill him. The servants were not to be afraid. Absalom himself had issued the order. They were to be strong and courageous. At the feast, they did exactly as Absalom commanded. Amnon was killed. The other sons of David mounted their mules and fled. Before they reached Jerusalem, a report came to David that Absalom had killed every one of the king's sons and that none had survived. David rose, tore his clothes, and lay on the ground. His servants stood around him with their clothes torn. Jonadab, the same man who had designed Amnon's deception against Tamar, corrected the report. The king should not believe that all his sons were dead. Only Amnon had been killed. Jonadab said that Absalom had been determined to do this since the day Amnon violated Tamar. Absalom fled. A watchman in Jerusalem saw a large group approaching along the road. Jonadab told David that these were the king's sons, just as he had said. The princes entered, raised their voices, and wept. David and all his servants wept bitterly with them. Absalom escaped to his maternal grandfather Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. He remained in Geshur for 3 years. David mourned for Amnon. When his grief over Amnon's death had subsided, the king's heart turned toward Absalom. Joab saw that David's heart was inclined toward his banished son. He devised a way to make David pronounce judgment on another family and then face the resemblance to his own. Joab sent to Tekoa for a wise woman. He instructed her to dress as a mourner, avoid using oil, and present herself as someone who had been grieving for a long time. He told her what to say. The woman entered David's presence, fell face down, and cried for help. David asked what troubled her. She said that she was a widow. Her husband was dead and she had 2 sons. The sons had fought each other in a field where no one was present to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the entire clan had risen against her. They demanded that she surrender the surviving son so they could execute him for killing his brother. If they killed him, she explained, they would extinguish the one remaining coal she possessed. Her husband would be left without a name or descendant on the earth. David told her to go home. He would issue an order concerning her case. The woman continued. She offered to bear any guilt arising from the king's decision so that David and his throne would remain innocent. David told her that if anyone threatened her, she should bring that person to him. The accuser would not trouble her again. She pressed for a stronger guarantee. She asked David to invoke the Lord so that the avenger of blood would not destroy her remaining son. David swore that not one hair of her son's head would fall to the ground. The woman then asked permission to speak further. Why, she asked, had the king devised something similar against the people of God? By giving this decision, David had pronounced judgment against himself because he had not brought his own banished son home. Everyone would die eventually, like water spilled on the ground that could not be gathered again. Yet God did not simply take life away. He devised means so that a banished person would not remain permanently cast out. The woman returned to her supposed case. She said that fear of her people had driven her to speak to the king. She trusted that David would deliver her and her son from the inheritance being erased. The king's judgment, she said, was like the wisdom of an angel of God, able to distinguish good and evil. David recognized another person's direction behind her words. He asked the woman not to conceal the truth. Was Joab involved in this? She admitted that he was. No one could turn to the right or left from what the king had asked. Joab had instructed her and placed the entire speech in her mouth. David summoned Joab and told him that he would grant the request. Joab was to go and bring Absalom back. Joab fell face down, blessed the king and thanked him. David's decision showed that Joab had found favor in his sight. Joab traveled to Geshur and returned with Absalom to Jerusalem. But David imposed a condition. Absalom was to go directly to his own house. He would not be permitted to see the king's face. Absalom was back in the capital, but remained excluded from David's presence. The separation lasted 2 years. No man in Israel was praised for physical appearance as Absalom was. From the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, no visible defect was found in him. When his hair became heavy, he cut it. The hair weighed 200 shekels by the royal standard. Absalom had 3 sons and a daughter. He named his daughter Tamar, and she was known as a beautiful woman. Absalom sent for Joab, intending to ask him to approach the king. Joab refused to come. Absalom sent for him a second time. Again, Joab refused. So Absalom gave his servants an order. Joab owned a field of barley next to Absalom's land. They were to set it on fire. The servants burned the field. Joab then came to Absalom's house and demanded to know why his barley had been destroyed. Absalom answered that he had called for Joab because he wanted him to carry a message to David. Why had Joab brought him back from Geshur? If he was going to remain isolated from the king, it would have been better to stay there. Absalom demanded to see David. If guilt was found in him, the king could put him to death. Joab went to David and delivered the message. David summoned Absalom. Absalom entered and bowed face down before the king. David kissed him. Absalom had regained access to the king and the capital. The wrong against Tamar, Amnon's killing, and Absalom's years of exclusion remained unsettled between them. Absalom began building a royal image of his own. He acquired a chariot and horses, with 50 men running ahead of him. Each morning, he rose early and positioned himself beside the road leading to the city gate, where people came seeking judgment from the king. Whenever someone approached with a dispute, Absalom called out and asked which town he came from. After hearing the case, Absalom assured the man that his claim was right and just. The problem, he said, was that the king had appointed no representative to hear him. Then Absalom described the role he wanted. If only he were made judge in the land, anyone with a complaint could come to him and receive justice. When a man tried to bow before him, Absalom reached out, took hold of him, and kissed him. He repeated this performance with Israelites who came to David for judgment. In this way, Absalom stole the hearts of the people. After 4 years, he asked David for permission to go to Hebron and fulfill a vow. While living in Geshur, Absalom said he had promised that if the Lord brought him back to Jerusalem, he would worship the Lord at Hebron. David told him to go in peace. Absalom traveled to the same city where David's kingship had first been recognized, but he was not going there simply to fulfill a vow. He had already sent secret messengers throughout the tribes. When they heard the sound of a trumpet, they were to announce that Absalom had become king at Hebron. 200 men from Jerusalem accompanied him as invited guests. They went innocently, knowing nothing about the conspiracy. While offering sacrifices, Absalom summoned Ahithophel from his hometown of Gilo. Ahithophel was one of David's counselors. His decision to join Absalom gave the revolt more than numbers. It gave the prince access to a man whose advice carried enormous authority. The conspiracy gained strength, and the number of people supporting Absalom continued to grow. A messenger reached David in Jerusalem with the news. The hearts of Israel had gone after Absalom. David responded immediately. He ordered the servants still with him to prepare to flee. If they remained, he said, none of them would escape Absalom. They had to leave quickly before Absalom overtook them and brought disaster upon the city with the sword. His servants answered that they would do whatever the king decided. David left Jerusalem with his household. He did not defend the capital from inside its walls. He left 10 concubines behind to care for the palace and led the rest away. The royal party stopped at the last house while the king's servants passed before him. The Cherethites, the Pelethites, and 600 Gittites who had followed David from Gath marched past. Among them was Ittai the Gittite. David questioned why Ittai should go. He was a foreigner and an exile from his own land. He had only recently arrived. David told him to return and remain with the new king. There was no reason for Ittai to wander with David into an uncertain future. He should take his people back, and mercy and faithfulness go with him. Ittai refused. He swore by the Lord and by the life of the king that wherever David went, whether it led to life or death, Ittai would go too. David accepted his answer. Ittai crossed over with his men and all the families accompanying them. The countryside wept aloud as the people passed. David and his followers crossed the Kidron Valley and moved toward the wilderness. Zadok came with the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They set it down, and Abiathar offered sacrifices while the people continued leaving the city. David would not use the Ark as a guarantee that Jerusalem must be restored to him. He told Zadok to carry it back. If David found favor with the Lord, he said, he would be brought back and would see the Ark and its dwelling place again. If not, the Lord could do whatever seemed good. Zadok and Abiathar would be more useful inside Jerusalem. Their sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan, could carry information. David would wait near the wilderness crossings until a message came. The priests returned the ark to the city and remained there. David climbed the Mount of Olives barefoot, with his head covered, weeping as he went. The people covered their heads and wept with him. Then word came that Ahithophel had joined Absalom's conspiracy. David prayed that Ahithophel's counsel would be turned into foolishness. As David reached the summit where God was worshipped, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with torn clothing and dirt on his head. Hushai was loyal to David, but David told him that accompanying the refugees would make him a burden. Hushai could serve him more effectively by returning to Jerusalem. He was to present himself to Absalom as a servant. He could say that as he had served the father, he would now serve the son. From inside Absalom's court, Hushai could frustrate Ahithophel's advice. Zadok and Abiathar would also be there. Anything Hushai heard in the palace could be passed to the priests, who would send their sons to David. Hushai returned to Jerusalem just as Absalom entered the city. David continued toward the wilderness. When he reached the summit beyond the Mount of Olives, Ziba was waiting for him. The servant responsible for Mephibosheth's estate had brought 2 saddled donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, summer fruit, and a skin of wine. David asked what the provisions were for. Ziba said that the donkeys were for the king's household to ride, the bread and fruit were for the men to eat, and the wine was for anyone who became exhausted in the wilderness. Then David asked where Mephibosheth was. Ziba claimed that Jonathan's son had remained in Jerusalem because he believed Israel would restore Saul's kingdom to him that day. David accepted Ziba's report without hearing Mephibosheth. He declared that everything belonging to Mephibosheth now belonged to Ziba. Ziba bowed and asked to continue finding favor with the king. As David approached Bahurim, another man connected to Saul's house came out against him. His name was Shimei, son of Gera. Shimei cursed David as he approached. He threw stones at David and his servants, though David's warriors and royal guards surrounded the king. "Get out!" Shimei shouted. He called David a man of blood and a worthless man. Shimei interpreted Absalom's rebellion as judgment for Saul's house. He declared that the Lord had returned Saul's blood upon David and had given the kingdom to Absalom. David was now caught in his own evil, Shimei said, because he was a man of blood. Abishai had heard enough. He asked why this dead dog should be allowed to curse the king. Let Abishai cross over and cut off his head. David refused. Again, he asked what he had to do with the sons of Zeruiah. His own son was seeking his life. How much more, then, this Benjaminite from Saul's tribe? David told Abishai to leave Shimei alone. If the Lord had told him to curse David, no one could demand to know why. The king did not claim that every accusation Shimei made was true. He left the matter under God's judgment. The Lord might look upon David's affliction and repay him with good for the curses spoken that day. David and his men continued along the road, while Shimei traveled on the hillside opposite them. He kept cursing, throwing stones and flinging dust. At last, the exhausted royal party reached its stopping place and rested. In Jerusalem, Absalom entered the capital with the men of Israel. Ahithophel was beside him. Then Hushai approached and cried, "Long live the king!" Absalom questioned him. Was this Hushai's loyalty to his friend? Why had he not gone with David? Hushai answered carefully. He would belong to the man chosen by the Lord, by the people, and by all the men of Israel. He would remain with that man. Then he asked whom he should serve. Should he not serve the king's son? As Hushai had served Absalom's father, he would now serve Absalom. The answer was accepted. Absalom turned to Ahithophel and asked what should be done next. Ahithophel advised him to take possession of the 10 concubines David had left to care for the palace. If all Israel heard that Absalom had made himself repulsive to his father, the men supporting his revolt would know that there could be no quiet reconciliation between father and son. Their commitment to Absalom would become stronger. A tent was set up for Absalom on the roof of the palace. There, in the sight of Israel, Absalom slept with his father's concubines. The place where David had once looked down and taken another man's wife now became the public setting for the humiliation Nathan had announced. What David had done secretly had returned upon his house under the open sky. In those days, Ahithophel's advice was treated as though a person had inquired directly of God. David had relied upon that counsel, and now Absalom did the same. David was beyond the city with a depleted company, dependent upon messages carried through loyal servants. Absalom held Jerusalem, the palace, and Ahithophel. And Ahithophel had more advice to give. Ahithophel advised Absalom to act that night. He asked permission to select 12,000 men and pursue David immediately. David and the people with him were exhausted and discouraged. A sudden attack would terrify them, and the men surrounding David would flee. Ahithophel did not propose a long battle against the entire company. He would strike only the king. Once David was dead, the people could be brought back to Absalom, and the nation would be at peace. The plan pleased Absalom and the elders of Israel. But Absalom also ordered that Hushai be summoned. Ahithophel's counsel was repeated, and Hushai was asked whether it should be followed. Hushai said that this time Ahithophel's advice was not good. David and his men were experienced fighters, he argued, and they were enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs. David understood battle and would not spend the night among the people where Ahithophel expected to find him. He would hide in a cave or another secure place. If some of Absalom's men fell in the first attack, a report would spread that his forces had been slaughtered. Even courageous soldiers would lose heart, because Israel knew that David was a warrior and that the men with him were strong. Hushai offered a plan that required far more time. All Israel should first be gathered to Absalom, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, until the army was as numerous as sand beside the sea. Absalom himself should lead them into battle. Then the gathered nation would find David wherever he was and fall upon him like dew covering the ground. Neither David nor any man with him would remain. If David withdrew into a fortified city, Hushai said, all Israel would bring ropes and drag that city away until not even a stone could be found. Absalom and the elders of Israel accepted Hushai's counsel over Ahithophel's. The decision changed David's chance of survival. Ahithophel had proposed a limited force moving that same night against weary fugitives. Hushai had proposed waiting until a national army could be assembled. The delay created time for David to receive warning, cross the Jordan, reach Mahanaim, receive provisions, and organize the men still loyal to him. The Lord had determined to frustrate Ahithophel's sound advice so that disaster would come upon Absalom. Hushai went to Zadok and Abiathar and reported both plans. Ahithophel had urged an immediate night attack. Hushai had answered with a slower national mobilization, and Absalom had accepted it. But David could not remain where the rapid plan would have found him. Hushai warned that he must not spend the night near the wilderness crossings. He and everyone with him had to cross the Jordan without delay, or the king and his entire company could be destroyed. The priest's sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, were waiting at En-Rogel. They could not risk being seen entering Jerusalem. A female servant carried information from the priests to them. Jonathan and Ahimaaz would then take the message to David. A young man saw them and reported their location to Absalom. The two messengers fled quickly to Bahurim. A man there had a well in his courtyard, and Jonathan and Ahimaaz climbed down inside it. The woman of the house spread a covering over the mouth of the well and scattered grain across it. Nothing on the surface revealed that two men were hiding below. Absalom's servants arrived at the house and asked where Jonathan and Ahimaaz had gone. The woman told them that the men had crossed the stream. The pursuers searched, but found no one. They abandoned the search and returned to Jerusalem. Jonathan and Ahimaaz climbed out of the well and continued to David. They told him to rise and cross the river quickly, because Ahithophel had advised an attack against him. David moved at once. His entire company crossed the Jordan during the night. By morning, not one person remained on the western side of the river. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and returned to his hometown. He put his household affairs in order, then hanged himself. He was buried in his father's tomb. David reached Mahanaim. Absalom crossed the Jordan with the army of Israel. He appointed Amasa as commander in Joab's place. Amasa was the son of Ithra and Abigail, who was related to Joab's mother Zeruiah. Absalom and his forces camped in the land of Gilead. At Mahanaim, 3 men brought support to David: Shobi from Rabbah, Machir from Lodebar, and Barzillai from Rogelim. They supplied bedding, bowls, and earthen vessels. They brought wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese. The provisions answered the immediate condition of David's company. The people had crossed the wilderness and the Jordan hungry, weary, and thirsty. At Mahanaim, they received food, equipment, and a place from which to prepare for Absalom's army. David counted the men with him and organized them into 3 divisions. 1/3 was placed under Joab, 1/3 under Abishai, and 1/3 under Ittai. Then David announced that he would go out with them. The people refused. If they fled, the enemy would not care about the loss. Even if half of them died, Absalom's army would still seek David. The king was worth 10,000 of them. He would serve them better by remaining available from the city. David accepted their decision. He stood beside the city gate while the 3 divisions marched past him under Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. As each commander passed, David gave the same public order. For his sake, they were to deal gently with Absalom. All the troops heard him. The battle spread into the forest of Ephraim. David's army defeated the forces of Israel, and 20,000 men died. The fighting scattered across a wide area, and the forest consumed more men that day than the sword. During the battle, Absalom encountered some of David's soldiers. He was riding a mule beneath the thick branches of a large tree when his head became caught. The mule continued forward. Absalom was left hanging between the ground and the branches. One of David's soldiers found him and reported it to Joab. Joab demanded to know why the man had not struck Absalom down. If he had killed him, Joab said, he would have given him 10 pieces of silver and a warrior's belt. The soldier refused the reward even after the fact. If 1,000 pieces of silver had been placed in his hands, he would not have raised them against the king's son. He had heard David command Joab, Abishai, and Ittai to protect Absalom. If the soldier had acted treacherously against Absalom's life, nothing would have remained hidden from the king. Joab himself would have stood apart and allowed the soldier to bear the consequences. Joab ended the exchange. He took 3 weapons and thrust them into Absalom while he was still alive in the tree. 10 of Joab's armor-bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. Joab sounded the trumpet, and his men stopped pursuing Israel. The rebel army was already defeated, and Joab called David's forces back. They removed Absalom's body, threw it into a large pit in the forest, and raised an enormous pile of stones over him. The surviving Israelites returned to their homes. Absalom had erected a monument for himself in the king's valley. He had said that he had no son to preserve his name, so he named the pillar after himself. It continued to be called Absalom's Monument. At the battlefield, Ahimaaz asked Joab for permission to run to David with news that the Lord had delivered him from his enemies. Joab refused. Ahimaaz would not carry news that day because the king's son was dead. Instead, Joab ordered a Cushite messenger to go. The man bowed and began running. Ahimaaz continued asking. Whatever the outcome, he also wanted to run. Joab asked what reward he expected when the news would bring him none. Ahimaaz still insisted, so Joab gave permission. Ahimaaz chose the route across the plain and overtook the Cushite. David was sitting between the city's inner and outer gates. A watchman climbed to the roof above the gate and saw a man running alone. The watchman called down to the king. David said that if the runner was alone, he carried news. Then the watchman saw a second runner following him. David again said that he must be bringing news. As the first man came closer, the watchman recognized the way Ahimaaz ran. David called him a good man and expected good news from him. Ahimaaz approached and cried out that all was well. He bowed before David with his face to the ground and blessed the Lord for delivering the men who had raised their hands against the king. David asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered that he had seen a great disturbance when Joab sent him, but he did not know what had happened. David told him to stand aside. The Cushite arrived and announced good news. The Lord had vindicated David by delivering him from everyone who had risen against him. David repeated the same question. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite answered that all the king's enemies and all who rose against him to do harm should become like that young man. David understood. He was shaken and went to the room above the gate. As he walked, he wept. "My son Absalom," he cried. "My son Absalom." He wished that he had died in Absalom's place. Again he called, "Absalom, my son, my son." Joab was told that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. The victory became a day of grief throughout the army. The soldiers heard that David was mourning his son, and they entered the city quietly, like men slipping away in shame after fleeing from battle. David covered his face and continued crying aloud. Joab went into the king's room and confronted him. David had humiliated the servants who had saved his life that day, along with the lives of his sons, daughters, wives, and concubines. Joab accused him of loving those who hated him and hating those who loved him. The king had shown that his commanders and servants meant nothing to him. Joab said that if Absalom were alive and every one of David's men were dead, David would be pleased. Then Joab gave him an immediate command. David must rise, go out, and speak encouragingly to his servants. If he did not, Joab swore that not one man would remain with him through the night. That would be a greater disaster than everything that had come upon him since his youth. David rose and took his seat at the city gate. When the soldiers heard that the king was sitting there, they assembled before him. Across the tribes of Israel, people began arguing about restoring him. David had delivered Israel from its enemies, they said, but had fled because of Absalom. Now Absalom, whom they had anointed, was dead. Why was no one taking action to bring David back? David sent word through Zadok and Abiathar to the elders of Judah. Why should Judah be the last tribe to restore the king when discussion throughout Israel had already reached him? Judah was David's own flesh and blood. David also sent a personal promise to Amasa. Amasa was his flesh and blood, and David swore that Amasa would become commander of the army in place of Joab. The offer brought the commander of Absalom's defeated forces into David's restoration and displaced the man who had killed Absalom against the king's public order. Judah responded as one body and sent word asking David and all his servants to return. David traveled to the Jordan. The people of Judah came to Gilgal to meet him and escort him across. Shimei hurried down with 1,000 men from Benjamin. Ziba also came with his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed through the Jordan to assist the king's household and do whatever David required during the crossing. Shimei fell before David. He asked the king not to hold him guilty or remember the wrong he had committed when David left Jerusalem. Shimei acknowledged that he had sinned. He pointed out that he had come as the first from the tribes of Joseph to meet the king. Abishai demanded that Shimei be put to death for cursing the Lord's anointed. David rejected the demand. He asked what he had to do with the sons of Uriah, who were acting as his adversaries that day. No Israelite would be executed on the day David was restored as king. He swore to Shimei that he would not die. Mephibosheth also came to meet David. He had not cared for his feet, trimmed his mustache, or washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he returned safely. David asked why Mephibosheth had not gone with him. Mephibosheth said that Ziba had deceived him. Because he could not walk, he had ordered his servant to saddle a donkey so he could ride with David. Ziba left without him and then slandered him before the king. Mephibosheth placed the decision in David's hands. The king was like an angel of God and could do what seemed right. His entire family had once stood under the threat of death, yet David had given him a place at the royal table. He had no further claim to demand. David ordered Mephibosheth and Ziba to divide the land. Mephibosheth answered that Ziba could take all of it now that David had returned safely. Barzillai came down from Rogelim and crossed toward the Jordan to escort David. He was 80 years old and very wealthy. He had supplied the king while David stayed at Mahanaim. David invited him to cross with the royal party and live in Jerusalem, where the king would provide for him. Barzillai declined. At his age, he said, he could no longer clearly taste what he ate and drank or enjoy the voices of singers. He did not want to become another burden upon David. He would accompany the king only a short distance beyond the Jordan. Then he wanted to return to his own city, where he could eventually be buried near his parents. Barzillai offered Chimham to go in his place. David agreed. Chimham would cross with him, and David would do for him whatever seemed good. He also promised to grant whatever Barzillai requested. David kissed Barzillai and blessed him. The king crossed the river, and Barzillai returned home. David continued to Gilgal. Judah escorted him, along with part of the people of Israel. Then the men of Israel confronted the men of Judah. Why had Judah taken possession of the king and secretly brought David, his household, and his men across the Jordan? Judah answered that David was their close relative. They had not eaten at the king's expense or received gifts for escorting him. Israel replied that the northern tribes had 10 shares in the king and therefore a greater claim than Judah. Why had Judah treated them with contempt when Israel had been the first to speak of bringing David back? The men of Judah answered even more harshly than the men of Israel. David had crossed back toward Jerusalem. The kingdom had not returned with him in peace. A Benjaminite named Sheba, son of Bichri, seized the tribal quarrel immediately. He was a worthless man. He sounded a trumpet and declared that Israel had no share in David and no inheritance in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent, Israel. The men of Israel abandoned David and followed Sheba. The men of Judah remained with the king and escorted him from the Jordan to Jerusalem. The argument over who possessed the restored king had now become another open rebellion. Sheba used the division to draw the northern tribes away before David had fully resumed control from the capital. When David entered the palace, he dealt first with the 10 concubines Absalom had publicly appropriated. He placed them in a guarded house and provided for them, but he no longer had relations with them. They lived in confinement for the rest of their lives, like widows, even though David remained alive. Sheba was still moving through Israel, and David needed the men of Judah assembled quickly. He ordered Amasa to summon them within 3 days and then report back. Amasa left to carry out the command. The 3 days passed, but he did not return by the appointed time. The commander David had placed over the army had failed to appear while Sheba was gathering support. David turned to Abishai. "Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom," David said. If Sheba reached fortified cities, he could secure himself inside them and escape beyond their reach. Abishai was to take David's servants and pursue him immediately. The force left Jerusalem. It included Joab's men, the Cherethites, the Pelethites, and David's strongest warriors. Although Abishai had received the command, Joab marched among them. They reached the great stone at Gibeon just as Amasa came to meet them. Joab was dressed in his military clothing. A sword was fastened at his waist, and as he stepped forward, it came loose into his hand. Joab addressed Amasa as his brother and asked whether he was well. Then he reached with his right hand and took Amasa by the beard as though to kiss him. Amasa did not guard himself against the sword in Joab's other hand. Joab stabbed him in the abdomen. Amasa's insides spilled onto the ground. Joab did not strike him a second time. Amasa died there. The commander David had appointed in Joab's place now lay beside the road, killed by the man he had replaced. Joab and Abishai continued pursuing Sheba. One of Joab's young men remained near Amasa's body and called to the soldiers moving along the road, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." But Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the middle of the road. Every soldier who reached him stopped. The dead commander was interrupting the pursuit even after Joab had moved on. When the young man saw that the body was delaying the army, he dragged Amasa from the road into a field. Then he covered him with a garment. Once Amasa had been removed, the troops passed and followed Joab after Sheba. Sheba traveled through the territories of Israel toward the north until he reached Abel-Beth-Maachah. Members of his own clan gathered behind him and entered the city with him. Joab's forces arrived and surrounded Abel. They built a siege ramp against the wall. The troops stood upon the ramp and began battering the fortifications to bring them down. The pursuit had reached the situation David wanted to prevent. Sheba was protected inside a fortified city, and Joab was preparing to destroy its defenses to reach him. Then a wise woman called from inside Abel, "Listen, listen, tell Joab to come here so I can speak to him." Joab approached the wall. The woman asked whether he was Joab. "I am," he answered. She told him to listen to the words of his servant. Joab agreed. The woman reminded him that people had long gone to Abel for wise judgment. They used to say, "Let them inquire at Abel," she told him, and in that way disputes were settled. She described herself as one of the peaceful and faithful people of Israel. Yet Joab was trying to destroy a city that was like a mother in Israel. "Why will you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?" she asked. Joab rejected the accusation. "Far be it from me," he answered, "that I should swallow up or destroy." He identified the man he wanted. Sheba, son of Bichri, had come from the hill country of Ephraim and raised his hand against King David. Joab demanded no other life from Abel and no further punishment against the city. "Hand him over," he said, "and I will withdraw from the city." The woman answered that Sheba's head would be thrown over the wall. She returned to the people of Abel and spoke with wisdom. They seized Sheba, cut off his head, and threw it to Joab. The negotiation changed the siege from the threatened destruction of Abel to the surrender of the man Joab had pursued there. Joab no longer had a reason to continue battering the wall. He sounded the trumpet. The troops withdrew from Abel, the siege ended, and every man returned home. Joab went back to David in Jerusalem. Sheba's rebellion was over. Amasa was dead, and Joab once again commanded the entire army of Israel. The other royal officers also remained in place. Benaiah commanded the Cherethites and Pelethites. Adoram oversaw forced labor. Jehoshaphat served as recorder, and Shiva served as secretary. Zadok and Abiathar served as priests, while Ira the Jairite served as a royal minister. Other events belong within David's reign, but their precise order is uncertain. A famine came upon the land and continued for 3 consecutive years, one year after another. David sought the Lord concerning it. He was told that the famine rested upon Saul and his blood-stained house because Saul had killed the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were not Israelites. They were a surviving group of Amorites whom the people of Israel had sworn to protect. Saul had attempted to destroy them out of zeal for Israel and Judah. The famine was connected to bloodshed committed against people living under Israel's oath. David summoned the Gibeonites and placed the question of atonement before them. "What shall I do for you?" he asked. "How shall I make atonement so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites said that their dispute with Saul's house could not be settled with silver or gold. They also said that they had no authority to put anyone in Israel to death. David told them to state what they wanted. "What you say, I will do for you." They answered by describing what Saul had done. He had consumed them and planned to destroy them so that they would have no place anywhere within Israel's borders. The Gibeonites requested 7 male descendants from Saul's house. Those 7 were to be handed over and executed before the Lord at Gibeah, the town of Saul, whom the Lord had chosen. David agreed to give them the 7 men, but he spared Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, because of the oath David and Jonathan had made before the Lord. David took Armoni and another man named Mephibosheth, the 2 sons whom Rizpah had borne to Saul. He also took 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel of Maholah. The 7 descendants of Saul were handed over to the Gibeonites. They were killed together on the mountain before the Lord. Their deaths came at the beginning of the barley harvest, when the first grain was being cut. All 7 fell together. Rizpah took sackcloth and spread it for herself on a rock beside the bodies. She remained there from the beginning of the harvest until rain fell from heaven upon them. By day, she kept the birds away. By night, she kept away the wild animals. Her vigil continued through the harvest season and did not end until water fell from heaven. David was told what Rizpah, Saul's former concubine, had done. He then acted concerning the remains of Saul's family. David went to recover the bones of Saul and Jonathan from the people of Jabesh Gilead. The men of Jabesh had secretly taken those remains from the public square at Beth-shan. The Philistines had displayed Saul and Jonathan there after striking them down on Mount Gilboa. The men of Jabesh had carried the bodies away and preserved the bones. David gathered the bones of Saul and Jonathan from them. The remains of the 7 descendants handed over to the Gibeonites were also collected from the place where they had been killed. The bones of Saul's house were brought together for burial, instead of remaining divided between Jabesh and the place of execution. They carried all of them into the land of Benjamin. There, at Zelah, they buried Saul and Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father Kish. Everything the king commanded concerning the burial was carried out. Afterward, God answered prayer for the land. During another conflict, the Philistines went to war against Israel. David went down with his servants and fought them. During the battle, David became exhausted. A warrior named Ishbi-Benob saw the king's condition and intended to kill him. Ishbi-Benob was one of the descendants of the giants. The bronze head of his spear weighed 300 shekels, and he was armed with a new sword. He moved against David, while the king's strength had failed. Abishai came to David's aid. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. David's men then made him swear that he would no longer go out with them into battle. They stated the danger directly. "You must not extinguish the lamp of Israel." The decision removed David from direct exposure to another Philistine champion. His servants would continue fighting, but they would not again place Israel's lamp within reach of an enemy when exhaustion overtook him. The struggle against the remaining champions continued through those warriors. At Gob, Israel again fought the Philistines. Sibbecai the Hushathite confronted Saph, another descendant of the giants. Sibbecai killed him. A separate battle also took place at Gob. Elhanan, son of Jare-Oregim of Bethlehem, confronted a Gittite champion. The man carried a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam. Elhanan killed him. Another battle took place at Gath. A huge warrior appeared there with an unusual physical distinction. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in all. He also descended from the giants. The man defied Israel. Jonathan, son of David's brother Shimea, confronted him. Jonathan killed him. Ishbi-Benob, Saph, the Gittite warrior at Gob, and the 6-fingered champion at Gath all belonged to the giant line of that Philistine city. Each fell through David or one of his servants. When Ishbi-Benob moved against an exhausted David, Abishai intervened. When the other champions rose against Israel, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan met them in battle. The king no longer stood alone against men of giant descent. His servants fought the battles in front of him, and their victories preserved the kingdom they served. David's warriors stood between the exhausted king and death. David sang about the God who had delivered him from all his enemies and from Saul. He called the Lord his rock, his fortress, and his deliverer. God was the rock in whom he took refuge, his shield, the power of his salvation, his stronghold, his place of safety, and the one who saved him from violence. David called upon the Lord, who was worthy of praise, and was saved from his enemies. He described mortal danger through images of forces closing around him. Waves of death surrounded him. Torrents of destruction overwhelmed him. The cords of the grave tightened around him, and the snares of death confronted him. In his distress, David called to the Lord. He cried to his God, and his voice was heard from God's dwelling. His cry reached God's ears. David sang of the answer in the language of creation, shaken by divine anger. The earth reeled and trembled. The foundations of heaven shook because God was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth, and burning coals blazed from it. He bowed the heavens and came down with thick darkness beneath his feet. God rode upon a cherub and flew. He appeared upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness a shelter around him, with dark waters and heavy clouds as his covering. Brightness broke through before him, and burning coals flamed out. The Lord thundered from heaven. The Most High sounded his voice. He sent arrows and scattered David's enemies. He hurled lightning and routed them. The channels of the sea appeared, and the foundations of the world were exposed at the Lord's rebuke, at the blast of breath from his nostrils. Then David moved from those vast poetic images to the act of rescue. God reached down from on high, took hold of him, and drew him out of deep waters. He rescued David from his powerful enemy and from those who hated him because they were too strong for him. They confronted him in the day of his calamity, but the Lord became his support. God brought him into a broad place and rescued him because he delighted in him. David described his deliverance in terms of his conduct before God. The Lord dealt with him according to his righteousness and rewarded him according to the cleanness of his hands. David said he had kept the ways of the Lord and had not acted wickedly by turning from his God. God's ordinances remained before him, and he did not turn aside from God's statutes. He had been blameless before God and had guarded himself from guilt. The Lord rewarded him according to his righteousness, according to the cleanness God saw. David then centered the character of the one who judges. With the faithful, God shows himself faithful. With the blameless, he shows himself blameless. With the pure, he shows himself pure. With the crooked, he deals shrewdly. God saves an afflicted people, but his eyes are against the proud, and he brings them down. David called the Lord his lamp, the one who illuminated his darkness. With God, he could advance against a troop. With his God, he could leap over a wall. God's way was perfect, and his word had been tested and proved true. He was a shield for everyone who took refuge in him. "Who is God besides the Lord?" David sang. "Who is a rock except our God?" God was the one who armed him with strength and made his way secure. He made David's feet like the feet of a deer and enabled him to stand on the heights. He trained David's hands for battle until his arms could bend a bow of bronze. God gave him the shield of salvation. God's help sustained him and made him great. He broadened the path beneath David so that his ankles did not turn. David sang of pursuing his enemies and destroying those who rose against him. He did not turn back until they were consumed. He consumed and crushed them so that they could not rise. They fell beneath his feet. God armed him with strength for battle and brought his adversaries down before him. His enemies turned their backs, and David destroyed those who hated him. They looked for help, but there was no one to save them. They called to the Lord, but he did not answer them. David beat them as fine as the dust of the earth. He crushed and trampled them like mud in the streets. God delivered him from conflict among his own people and preserved him as the head of nations. A people David had not known served him. Foreigners submitted when they heard of him. They lost courage and came trembling from their strongholds. David's song returned to the living God who had saved him. The Lord lives. David blessed his rock and exalted the God who was the rock of his salvation. God brought vengeance for him, subdued peoples beneath him, and brought him out from among his enemies. God lifted him above those who rose against him and rescued him from violent men. Therefore David would praise the Lord among the nations and sing to his name. God gave great victories to his king and showed steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. David also spoke about the authority behind his words. He identified himself as David, son of Jesse, the man raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the singer of Israel's songs. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through him, and God's word was on his tongue. The God of Israel had spoken about the ruler who governs people justly and rules in the fear of God. Such a ruler is like the light of morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, when brightness after rain brings grass from the earth. Justice under God was presented not only as authority over people, but as light that enables life to rise. David then spoke of his own house before God. God had established an everlasting covenant with him, ordered in every detail and secure. David connected that covenant with his salvation and with the fulfillment of what God had promised. Its security rested with the God who had made it. But worthless men were like thorns thrown aside. They could not be gathered by hand. Anyone who touched them armed himself with iron or with the shaft of a spear, and they were burned completely where they lay. Just rule and destructive wickedness stood opposite each other in David's words, while the future of his house depended upon God's covenant. The kingdom's victories had also depended on warriors whose deeds stood beside David's own. Bathsheba, chief among the 3 leading warriors, raised his spear against 800 men and killed them in one encounter. After him came Eleazar, son of Dodo, the Ahohite. He was with David when they defied the Philistines who had gathered for battle. The men of Israel withdrew, but Eleazar stood and struck the Philistines until his hand grew tired and clung to his sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. Shammah, son of Agi, the Hararite, stood in another place where the Philistines had assembled. There was a field full of lentils, and Israel's troops fled before the enemy. Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field. He defended it and struck down the Philistines. The Lord brought about a great victory there as well. During harvest, 3 of the 30 leading men went down to David at the cave of Adullam. A Philistine force was camped in the valley of Rephaim. David was in the stronghold, and a Philistine garrison occupied Bethlehem. David expressed a longing for water from the well near Bethlehem's gate. The 3 warriors broke through the Philistine camp, drew water from the well beside the gate, and carried it back to him. David refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Lord, I would never do this," he said. "Is this not the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?" The water had reached him through the danger those 3 men accepted. David would not consume what their blood had nearly purchased. He poured it out to the Lord, and the deed of the 3 stood among the acts that distinguished David's warriors. Abishai, Joab's brother, commanded another distinguished group. He raised his spear against 300 men and killed them. His name became renowned among the 30. He served as their commander and received honor among them, though he did not attain the standing of the first 3. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, came from Kabzeel and performed mighty deeds. He struck down 2 warriors of Moab. On a snowy day, he went down into a pit and killed a lion. He also confronted an imposing Egyptian who carried a spear. Benaiah approached him with a staff, seized the spear from the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with the man's own weapon. These deeds made Benaiah renowned among the 30. He received greater honor than the rest of that group, though he did not equal the first 3. David placed him over his guard. The company extended beyond its leading figures. Asahel, Joab's brother, stood among the 30, as did Elhanan, son of Dodo, from Bethlehem. There were Shammah the Haradite, Elika the Haradite, Helez the Paltite, and Ira, son of Ikesh, from Tekoa. Abiezer came from Anathoth, Mebunai from Hushah, Zalmon from Ahwa, and Maharai from Netophah. Heleb, son of Baanah, was also from Netophah. Ittai, son of Ribai, came from Gibeah in Benjamin. Benaiah came from Pirathon, Hiddai from the ravines of Gash, and Abialbon from Beth Arabah. Asmaveth came from Bahurim, Eliabah from Shalbon, and Jonathan was a son of Shammah the Hararite. Ahiam was the son of Sharar the Hararite. Eliphelet was the son of Ahasbai from Beth Maacah. Eliam was the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. Hezro came from Carmel, and Parai from Arab. Igal was the son of Nathan from Zobah. Bani came from Gad. Zelek the Ammonite stood among them, as did Naharai from Beeroth, the armor-bearer of Joab. Ira and Gareb were Ithrites. And among the named warriors appeared Uriah the Hittite. 37 men were named in all. David's victories had been carried through the courage, endurance, and blood of men whose individual deeds and identities remained attached to the kingdom's strength. These events belong within David's reign, but their precise order is uncertain. At one point, the Lord's anger burned against Israel. and David was incited to act against the nation by ordering a census of Israel and Judah. He commanded Joab, the army commander who was with him, to travel throughout all the tribes, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. Joab and the commanders were to count the people so that David would know their number. Joab challenged the command. He said, "May the Lord your God multiply the people 100 times over, while the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king desire this?" The king's command prevailed over Joab and the army commanders. They left David's presence and began the work of counting Israel. They crossed the Jordan and camped near Aroer on the south side of the city, in the middle of the valley. From there, they traveled through Gad and toward Jazer. They went to Gilead and the land of Tahtim Hodshi, then continued to Danjan and around toward Sidon. They came to the fortress of Tyre and passed through the cities of the Hivites and Canaanites. Then they went south through Judah and completed the journey at Beersheba in the Negev. After traveling throughout the land, they returned to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Joab delivered the totals to the king. Israel had 800,000 able men who could handle a sword. Judah had 500,000. After the people had been counted, David's heart struck him. He said to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, take away the guilt of your servant, for I have acted very foolishly." When David rose the next morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer. Gad was given 3 possible judgments to place before the king. Gad came to David and delivered the choice. 7 years of famine could come upon the land. David could flee before his enemies for 3 months while they pursued him. Or there could be 3 days of plague throughout the land. "Now think it over," Gad told him, "and decide what answer I should take back to the one who sent me." The 3 judgments placed David before famine, pursuit, or plague. He answered Gad, "I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, because his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into human hands." The Lord sent a plague upon Israel from that morning until the appointed time. From Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 people died. Then the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. As destruction approached the city, the Lord relented concerning the disaster. "Enough," he told the angel who was striking the people. "Withdraw your hand." The angel of the Lord was beside the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David saw the angel who was striking the people and spoke to the Lord. "I have sinned and I have acted wickedly," David said. "But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand fall against me and against my father's house." That same day, Gad came to David with an instruction. David was to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David went up in obedience to the word Gad had given him. Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants approaching. He went out, bowed before the king with his face to the ground, and asked, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David answered, "To buy the threshing floor from you, so that I may build an altar to the Lord, and the plague on the people may be stopped." Araunah offered David everything required for the sacrifice. He told the king to take the threshing floor and offer whatever seemed good to him. The oxen were there for the burnt offering. The threshing sledges and the wooden yokes of the oxen could be used for fuel. Araunah placed it all before David. "My lord the king," he said, "Araunah gives all this to the king. May the Lord your God accept you." But David would not take the ground, the animals, and the wood without payment. "No," he answered, "I insist on buying it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. There he built an altar to the Lord. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. The Lord answered the plea for the land, and the plague against Israel was stopped. At a later point not dated from this crisis, David's physical strength failed. David was old and advanced in years. His servants covered him with blankets, but he could not become warm. The men attending him proposed that a young woman be found to remain near the king, stand before him, care for him, and lie beside him so that her body would provide warmth. They would search throughout the territory of Israel and bring the young woman into David's service. The search was made, and they found Abishag, a young woman from Shunem. Abishag was very beautiful. She was brought into David's chamber, where she attended him and cared for him. She lay beside him to keep him warm, but David had no sexual relations with her. David's physical weakness was visible within the palace. Servants arranged his coverings, and Abishag remained beside him because his body could not retain warmth. Yet David still held royal authority. Priests, commanders, guards, and palace servants continued to answer to his command. His body had weakened, but no son had been publicly installed on his throne. Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself. "I will be king," he declared. He acquired a chariot and horses and arranged for 50 men to run ahead of him. The chariot moved with a company that visibly presented Adonijah's claim. The runners went before him, and he openly spoke of himself as the man who would become king. David had never rebuked Adonijah by asking why he behaved as he did. Adonijah was a very handsome man who had been born after Absalom. He conferred with Joab, the commander of the army, and with Abiathar the priest. Both men supported him. Their offices gave Adonijah visible backing within the military command and the priesthood. The royal son, the army commander, and the priest now acted together. But other officials did not join them. Zadok the priest did not support Adonijah. Nathan the prophet remained apart. Benaiah, who commanded the royal guard, also withheld his support. Shimei, Ray, and the king's senior warriors did not follow Adonijah. The men holding authority around the palace had divided. Adonijah had Joab and Abiathar beside him, while Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, and David's royal guard remained outside his coalition. Adonijah then organized a sacrificial gathering near En-Rogel, beside the stone of Zoheleth. He sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened calves. The gathering became a large feast. Adonijah invited his brothers, the other sons of David. He also invited royal officials from Judah. Joab and Abiathar joined him. The guests sat before Adonijah, eating and drinking from the sacrifices he had provided. The people present formed a visible gathering around his claim. The exclusions were equally clear. Nathan was not invited. Zadok was not invited. Benaiah and the king's senior warriors were not invited. Solomon was not invited. Adonijah welcomed the other royal sons while leaving Solomon outside the feast. The officials who had refused to support Adonijah were also excluded from the gathering where he was being acclaimed. David did not know what Adonijah had done. Nathan learned that Adonijah was being treated as king and went to Bathsheba. He asked whether she had heard the news. Adonijah had become king, and David did not know it. Then Nathan told Bathsheba that he would give her advice to save her life and Solomon's life. His plan had a precise sequence. Bathsheba was to enter David's chamber first. She would remind the king of the oath he had made to her. Had David not sworn that Solomon would reign after him and sit upon his throne? Once the oath had been placed before David, Bathsheba was to ask the question created by the events at En-Rogel. Why, then, had Adonijah become king? Nathan would not enter with her at the beginning. While Bathsheba was still speaking, he would arrive separately and confirm her words. David would first hear the succession promise from Bathsheba. Then Nathan would independently describe Adonijah's active claim, the feast, and the people who had been excluded. Bathsheba entered the king's chamber. Abishag was there, attending David. Bathsheba bowed low before him. The king asked, "What do you want?" She addressed him as her lord and began with his sworn word. David had sworn to her by the Lord his God that Solomon would reign after him and sit upon his throne. But now, she said, Adonijah has become king. David had not authorized it, and he did not know it was happening. Bathsheba described the gathering still underway. Adonijah had sacrificed cattle, fattened calves and sheep in great numbers. He had invited the king's sons, Abiathar the priest, and Joab the commander of the army. They were eating and drinking before him. They were proclaiming, "Long live King Adonijah." Then Bathsheba named the son Adonijah had excluded. Solomon had not been invited. The oath named Solomon, but the active feast honored Adonijah. Bathsheba told David that the eyes of all Israel were upon him. The nation needed the king to declare who would sit upon his throne after him. Until David spoke, Adonijah's feast stood in public, while the king's oath concerning Solomon remained inside the palace. Bathsheba also stated the immediate danger to herself and Solomon. If David died without acting, they would be treated as offenders. While Bathsheba was still speaking, Nathan arrived. A servant announced him to the king. Nathan entered David's presence and bowed with his face to the ground. He began with a direct question. Had David declared that Adonijah would reign after him and sit upon his throne? Nathan then gave his own report. Adonijah had gone down that day and sacrificed cattle, fattened calves and sheep in abundance. He had invited the king's sons, the commanders of the army, and Abiathar the priest. The guests were eating and drinking before him. They were saying, "Long live King Adonijah." Nathan identified those whom Adonijah had not summoned. Nathan himself had not been invited. Neither had Zadok, Benaiah, or Solomon. Had David ordered this without informing his servants? Had he decided who would sit upon his throne without telling the officials responsible for carrying out his will? Bathsheba had invoked David's oath and named the danger to herself and Solomon. Nathan confirmed the sacrifices, the guests, the acclamation, and the exclusions. Neither audience allowed Adonijah's actions to remain outside David's knowledge. David answered by issuing a command. He ordered that Bathsheba be called back into his presence. She returned and stood before him. David invoked the living Lord, who had delivered him from every distress, and renewed his oath. The promise he had made concerning Solomon would stand. Solomon would reign after David. Solomon would sit upon his throne, and the promise would be carried out that very day. Adonijah's feast remained active, but David had now spoken as king and named Solomon as his successor. Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground. She honored David and said, "May my lord King David live forever." David immediately gave another order. Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah were to be summoned. The three men entered together. David told them to take the royal servants with them. They were to place Solomon upon David's own mule and escort him down to Gihon. The mule belonged to the reigning king. Solomon would ride it under David's direct command, accompanied by the royal officials, guards, and servants David had appointed. At Gihon, Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet were to anoint Solomon king over Israel. After the anointing, the trumpet was to sound. The people were to proclaim, "Long live King Solomon." Then the entire procession was to follow Solomon back toward Jerusalem. He would enter the city, sit upon David's throne, and reign in David's place. David stated the full reach of the appointment. Solomon was to become ruler over Israel and Judah. The order established every action that would make the decision public. The royal servants would form the procession. David's mule would carry Solomon. The priest and prophet would anoint him. The trumpet and public acclamation would announce him to Jerusalem. Benaiah answered, "Amen." He asked that the Lord confirm David's command. As God was with David, let him now be with Solomon. Let Solomon's throne become greater than David's throne. The officials acted without delay. Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, the royal guard, and the royal servants placed Solomon upon David's mule. They escorted him down from Jerusalem to Gihon. Benaiah and the guards protected the procession. Nathan accompanied Solomon as the prophet who had brought the crisis before David. Zadok carried the priestly responsibility for the anointing. The royal servants moved with them as the king had commanded. They reached Gihon. Zadok took the horn of oil from the sacred tent. He poured the oil upon Solomon and anointed him king. The trumpet sounded. The people cried out, "Long live King Solomon!" Then they followed him upward toward Jerusalem. Pipes played among them. The people rejoiced with such force that the ground seemed to split from the sound. Solomon was already anointed. He rode David's mule at the center of the authorized royal procession. Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, the guards, and the servants moved with him while the public celebration advanced toward the city. At En-Rogel, Adonijah's guests were still assembled around the feast. The sound reached them. Joab heard the trumpet. As Adonijah and his guests finished eating, the noise from Jerusalem reached them. Joab asked why the city was in such an uproar. Before anyone could answer, Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, arrived. Adonijah welcomed him as a worthy man and assumed that he carried good news. Jonathan answered, "No." King David had made Solomon king. Then Jonathan described exactly what had happened. David had sent Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, the Cherethites, and the Pelethites with Solomon. They had placed him on the king's mule. Zadok and Nathan had anointed him at Gihon, and the procession had returned to the city with rejoicing. That celebration was the noise Adonijah's guests could hear. Solomon had taken his seat on the royal throne. Jonathan had more news from inside the palace. David's servants had entered the king's presence to congratulate him. They asked that God make Solomon's name even greater than David's, and Solomon's throne greater than his father's throne. David had received their words from his bed. He bowed in worship and blessed the Lord, the God of Israel, for allowing one of his descendants to sit upon the throne, while David was still alive to see it. The report stripped Adonijah's gathering of every claim it had tried to display. David was not dead. He had not been consulted by Joab and Abiathar. He had not recognized Adonijah's feast, procession, sacrifices, or declaration. Instead, the reigning king had selected Solomon, placed him upon the royal mule, sent the authorized priest and prophet to anoint him, surrounded him with the royal guard, and seated him on the throne. Adonijah's guests began trembling. They rose and scattered, each going his own way. The coalition dissolved before it ever entered Jerusalem. Adonijah was now afraid of Solomon. He left the feast and went to the altar, where he took hold of its horns. Word reached Solomon that Adonijah feared him and was clinging to the altar. Adonijah was asking for an oath that Solomon would not put him to death with the sword. Solomon gave a measured answer. If Adonijah proved himself worthy, not one hair of his head would fall to the ground. But if wickedness were found in him, he would die. Solomon did not grant an unconditional oath. He offered life under a condition of loyal conduct. Then he sent men to bring Adonijah down from the altar. Adonijah came and bowed before King Solomon. The man who had declared himself king now stood before the son David had placed on the throne. Solomon told him to go home. For the moment, there was no execution, imprisonment, or public humiliation. Adonijah was released, but the terms were clear. His life now depended upon what kind of man his actions revealed him to be. Solomon occupied the throne, yet David remained alive, and the transfer of royal authority still required a final charge. As David's death approached, he called Solomon. He began with the fact neither of them could avoid. "I am going the way of all the earth." David told Solomon to be strong and show himself a man. The strength he required was not defined first by armies, wealth, or the removal of rivals. Solomon was to keep the charge of the Lord his God. He must walk in God's ways and observe the statutes, commandments, ordinances, and testimonies written in the law of Moses. If Solomon did this, he would prosper in what he did and wherever he turned. David connected that obedience to the words spoken over his own house. The promise of an enduring dynasty did not release David's descendants from faithfulness. The Lord had said that if David's sons watched how they lived and walked faithfully with their whole heart and soul, David would not lack a man upon Israel's throne. Solomon had received the kingship through David's oath and public command. Continuing faithfully in that kingship required more than being David's chosen son. He would have to govern under the law that also governed the king. Then David turned to specific matters waiting inside the kingdom. He spoke first about Joab. Solomon knew what Joab had done to David and what he had done to Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether, the two commanders of Israel's army. Joab had killed them. David described those killings as the blood of war shed in a time of peace. Joab had placed innocent blood upon the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. David told Solomon to act according to his wisdom. Joab's grey head was not to descend to the grave in peace. Joab remained a formidable figure. He had commanded Israel's army through wars, rebellions, and restorations. He had killed men whom David had received in peace and had removed Amasa after David appointed him commander. He had also supported Adonijah's attempt to take the throne. David did not prescribe the exact circumstance under which Solomon must act. He placed the matter under Solomon's wisdom while making clear that Joab's bloodshed could not remain outside royal judgment. Then David named a loyalty that was to be rewarded rather than punished. Solomon was to show steadfast kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead. They were to eat at the king's table. Barzillai had come to David with provisions when the king fled from Absalom. He had supported the royal household when David and his people were hungry, thirsty, and exhausted beyond the Jordan. David had invited Barzillai to Jerusalem, but the old man had declined and sent Chimham in his place. Now the kindness shown during David's humiliation was to continue under Solomon. Barzillai's family would retain a place near the king. Finally, David spoke about Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjaminite from Bahurim. Shimei had cursed David severely on the day David fled Jerusalem. Later he came down to meet David at the Jordan, confessed his offense, and received an oath that David would not kill him with the sword. David would not violate that oath himself, but he told Solomon not to regard Shimei as innocent. Solomon was wise and would know what action to take. David instructed him to bring Shimei's grey head down to the grave in blood. The dying king had now placed 3 different obligations before his successor. Joab's violence required judgment. Barzillai's loyalty required enduring kindness. Shimei's offense and David's oath required Solomon to act with wisdom after David was gone. These were not distant questions. Joab and Abiathar had just stood with Adonijah. The rival claimant had only recently bowed before Solomon and returned home under conditional mercy. The new king inherited not only a throne, but men whose histories, loyalties, offenses, and power could shape whether that throne remained secure. David's charge gave Solomon the governing standard first, fidelity to the Lord and obedience to the law. Then it named the unfinished human realities that law and wisdom would have to address. David's words ended. He died and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 years in Jerusalem. Solomon sat upon the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. And in Jerusalem, David rested in the stronghold that bore his name. The throne now belonged to Solomon, but David's burial place remained in the city he had made the seat of the kingdom, the city of David.